Hello, my name is Hollow of Dawn, and Leafblady has a theory. My theory is covering a very broad topic, interweaving and integrating many other theories into it to make my ultimate prediction for the story of Deltarune. And I will be making many controversial claims throughout it because of that. The main theory, though, is my belief that many of the events of Deltarune, including its past, present, and future, can be related to the sword route that appears within Chapter 3. That seems all but confirmed. However, due to the highly interpretive nature of the sword route, it's highly likely that not everything I say will come to pass exactly as I say it. What I am offering within this video is my interpretation of the sword route events, informed by the context I have from combing over this game's dialogue back and forth multiple times, and assessing many other theories about it. I'm more than happy to discuss any of these interpretations I've made with fans, and hear other interpretations of different events within the sword route people come up with to further build this theory up. Additionally, I would like to make clear at the start that some monsters within the sword route can be mapped to multiple characters within Deltarune, and sometimes a character within Deltarune can be represented by different monsters or objects within the sword route. They are context dependent, so it is important to not be rigid in interpretation when that interpretation doesn't make sense with the context given. With that out of the way, let's head into the theory. The sword route, the original game, the S-rank room game, mantle, manhole, whatever you want to call it. It's a game within the game of Deltarune that many have claimed to be an instruction manual for the weird route. While that is certainly true, I think that only scratches the surface of what the game is communicating to us. Because when discussing the sword route as a weird route tutorial, that only covers 1, maybe 2/7 of the whole game. That fraction sounds oddly specific, but let me explain. The sword route, when broken down, has 7 relevant sections. When people are talking about the sword route being a tutorial for the weird route, they are focusing on the part within board 2 where you have the white cloak freeze enemies for you, which mirrors how you have Chris command Noelle to freeze enemies for you in Chapter 2. Maybe they'll mention how board 3 seems to show you attacking monsters, reminiscent of hometown citizens, and say that will be necessary for the weird route as well. However, both of these only cover half of the boards they are present on, and even within those halves, there are details being overlooked. You see, each of the boards within the sword route start in what I will refer to as the light world section, which is separated by its dark world section by a barrier of sorts. In the desert board, after you cut the cacti to access the cold area, the background colors of the game get covered in a filter. This mirrors how the colors of the lighteners in the dark world changes compared to how they are in the light world. In the island board and city board, their dark world sections take place in the ice palace and manhole dungeons respectively, completely dark areas that you access through a locked door and a manhole. A palace and a manhole leading underground would be perfect environments for the dark found in the foreman, and the ice palace is where you freeze enemies with the ice cloak. So it is meant to parallel a part of the story of Deltarune where you are in the dark world of Chapter 2. Now consider the important encounters you have in Chapter 2's Light World section. You see Toriel at the start of the day, Office for Class, and Undyne directing traffic, all before you go into the Dark World. When we look at the enemies on board 2, we see purple monsters, which match the color of Toriel's dress, yellow lizards, which matches Alphys calling herself the anonymous yellow lizard, and a blue fish monster, which matches with Undyne. These are the only enemies present in this section because they are carefully chosen to correlate to what we can experience in Chapter 2 within the Light World. They're not just random encounters we have to mindlessly grind to get to the part that matters. Interestingly, Chapter 2 takes place on the same day as Chapter 3, making it the present. Therefore, if board 2 is the present, then what would that say about the boards that precede and succeed it? There are many hints throughout the game that Asgore will be the final boss of Chapter 5, like the Flower Man prophecy panel in Chapter 4, and the yellow monster, Asgore, throwing red spears surrounded by 7 flowers in board 3. So the idea that it's meant to show the future seems all but confirmed to many people, even if it's a future twisted by the weird route. But logically, if board 3 is the future and board 2 is the present, then what would that say about board 1? I think you already know the answer. So moving under that assumption, let's start from the true beginning of Deltarune, board 1, and see what we might discern from it. Looking at the Light World section of Board 1, something that strikes me right off the bat is that in all the appearances of the blue fish monster, it is accompanied by a purple monster. One the bottom right of the board, one the top left, and one in the center, where the purple monster is on the bridge below the waterfall. We already established the yellow monster on board 3 as Asgore, so it makes sense for other monsters related to him to be palette swaps of this one within the game. While I said earlier that on board 2 the purple monsters are Toriel, this is why I said that context is important. For board 1, I believe the purple monster is meant to represent Azrael, while the blue fish monster represents Onion. This is because if you try to name Onion Azrael too, they say it reminds them of someone from the past who fed them cornflakes, which basically confirms it was Azrael. This event canonically happened in the past. Meanwhile, we have no suggestion of a past relationship between Toriel and Onion, or even Undyne. Maybe that's possible, but I don't see the significance in it, so I think the former interpretation has more merit. In another part, we see a golden rod monster next to 3 flowers in the soil, likely representing Asgore tending to his garden. Notably, this is the only board with the golden rod monster. I think this is because of Asgore's past role as the police chief, with the golden color being that of a police badge, and the loss of it in later boards represents Asgore's loss of this role. Goldenrod is also a color of good luck and fortune, and it would be fair to say that Asgore lost those after this event, living in this shop rather than a home. The other parts of the Light World section though are harder to pin down what events they might symbolize, but it's notable that you only see purple monsters, goldenrod monsters, blue fish, and flowers here. No yellow lizards, as Alphys hasn't moved into hometown yet. In addition, the fact that Irem and Friend can be found in the caves in the dark suggests that they were operating in the past as well. Friend is of course heavily speculated as the Mike, or Mike, involved with Spamton's rise and fall. This implies that Tenna's proposed deal with the male guy, Spamton, was 10 years ago, further corroborating the idea that the deal fell through all the way back then because of Mike abandoning Spamton. I think we could go a step further though and pinpoint a period of activity when Dark Worlds were being opened and closed in the past. The Forgotten Man says, "Whether 11 hours or 11 years, Deltarune will be waiting," which I read as Gaster's Dark World experiments and desire to obtain his Deltarune started 11 years ago. In addition, the How to Draw Dragons book, which depicts a purple dragon on the cover, is 2,583 days overdue, roughly a little over 7 years ago, and is a book that Azrael will never return. I think that's because it's related to whatever stopped the exploration of Dark Worlds in the past, and the toys in the unused classroom being locked away long ago, as Sham states. During that 4-year period, it's likely that the kids played with their toys as Darkners in the Dark Worlds. However, when strange stuff started happening to those they cared about, like Jevil and Spamton, they investigated, and through that they became aware of the prophecy. We see in Chapter 3's Dark World that Toriel has a crown, as if she was a queen. Following that, it only makes sense that Azrael would be a prince, the prince from the dark, the 3rd hero. Des then is the girl with hope crossed on her heart, the 2nd hero. The girl found love from Azrael, as hinted by Tenna's quiz saying that Azrael's favorite character in Smashing Fighters changed from the Green Lizard to the Sword Magician. We know that Brady, a Green Lizard, made Azrael give her his first kiss during a game of Truth or Dare. So Azrael's favorite changed from the Green Lizard, Brady, to the Sword Magician, Des. You might be asking why the quiz doesn't show a purple cat, since Azrael went to the junior dance with Caddy and even wrote a love letter to her. Well, I think that's due to Tenna being unplugged and no longer being aware of recent events, such as the cowboy show being cancelled. In addition, we also see a striped green and yellow shirt in Des's closet, Azrael's shirt. What's interesting is that this shirt is sold as merch on Fangamer with the following description: the pattern of a shirt worn by a beloved someone. Your love will become theirs. Their love will become yours. However, the 2nd and 3rd heroes couldn't find the 1st hero. Des tried to fake hearts to create a Darkner that could function as it, but it just didn't work, with more and more fake hearts piling up in her closet. However, one day, one of those fake hearts, a demon heart, led them to something very interesting. The final thing to note here is the area leading up to the Dark World section. To get to it, we go down a long, narrow pathway surrounded by trees. There's only one place in Hometown reminiscent of this, and I'm sure you've already guessed it. Though you might be wondering why we don't physically see the shelter here then, I think the fact that the Dark World section doesn't take place in a dark area like Board 2 and 3 is an intentional misrepresentation to hide from Chris that this game was exploring their past, so they wouldn't resist playing as they tried to do when the shelter appears at the very end of Board 3. At the beginning of the game, it's much easier to drop it when things get too difficult, but when you're so close to the end, it's difficult to stop. You want to see how it ends. You need to see how it ends. In addition, there's an organic in Chapter 4 that you can find in a certain room with the prophecy panel Roots, and the only readable book in this extensive library. Their dialogue is jumbled up, but when unscrambled, they say that the children got lost where the forest would grow by following the pointed tail. Where the forest would grow suggests the kids got lost in the shelter, a clearing where the forest should be, but no longer grows there. Noelle even said that the four of them would explore the forest together. The prophecy panel might even be depicting the shelter, with the house-like structure depicted between two trees, suggesting that it was home for someone where they put down their roots. Finally, the area here does give us one final hint that this is the shelter. The cacti that separates the Light World and Dark World sections. The members of the Holiday family are all associated with different flowers. For Noelle, it is the rose, the flower of love, one that she almost received from Susie, and one that almost appeared in a certain cutscene that's no longer present in the game. Rudy also receives roses from Asgore, which has some interesting implications, though the flowers he receives from Asgore in Chapter 2 and 4 don't appear to be roses, and I can't confidently determine what they might be to get a reading on their implications. Any experts in flower identification and symbology, I'd appreciate your help here. That said, his association with flowers is rather evident. So then, what about Carol? I believe her flower is the cactus. One of the descriptions of the cactus within Chris's home is that it loves you, but mainly shows a sharp side. The Pippins in Tenna's desert board mentions it's important to push your loved ones aside sometimes after you push the cactus. While Asgore says that Carol is lovely once you get to know her, throughout the game we get affirmation that despite Carol's harsh behavior, she does have a softer side. You know, like a certain word that Chris hates. So if Carol is the cactus, the act of cutting it down in the game is likely symbolic of the kids sneaking past Carol, the one who limits access to the shelter. Interestingly, there's also some unused dialogue you can find in the code of the game. I think there's a crying child on the other side of these cactuses, the same place you can find the unused code about the girl trapped in what many assume to be the shelter. Now we have finally reached the Dark World section. We see a purple monster with two flowers beside them. Asriel, of course, and the two with him are Des and Noelle, as they are both members of the Holiday family who are associated with flowers. In another room, we will again see a purple monster with two flowers, implying that this encounter happened multiple times. It's notable that we play the game as Hero_Sword, a knight who is dueling the hero Strife by Strife, as one of the prophecy panels depicts. In between the two rooms with the purple monsters and flowers, we fight two goldenrod monsters, Asgore once again. I'll take this time here to mention the number of monsters is not necessarily indicative of an actual number. I don't believe there are two Asgores here. Rather, I think in this case it is indicative of the difficulty of the encounter. Following the second room of a purple monster with two flowers, we then see three purple monsters, implying this is Asriel alone, at their strongest, facing the knight. But why is Asriel alone? My personal belief is that Noelle was either manipulated by what was attacking them to use Snowgrave on Des, or Noelle accidentally used Snowgrave on Des when trying to attack the knight. I'll be leaning towards the former for this interpretation. However, either way, I don't think it's a coincidence that Snowgrave applies a blue filter to the screen like we see in the cold area of Board 1. This connection between the shelter, Snowgrave, and Des goes much further though. When Noelle looks at the door of Spamton's shop in Chapter 2, she comments on it being creepy, yet nostalgic with a sad look. This metal door in the trash pile has a striking resemblance to the shelter entrance, with its own metal doors built into the hill. Also, before your confrontation with Birdley, where you would use the spell D.OGG plays, which is a slowed down version of the bass line in Raise Up Your Bat, a song strongly associated with Des. Further implying she was on the receiving end of a snowgrave as well, and died, as snowgrave is described as a spell that is able to inflict fatal damage. But what led to Des being snowgraved? I think the shattered part of the prophecy might tell us. My belief is that the part of the prophecy shattered by Susie says that the girl will be sacrificed to save the world. It's a common trend in many media, and even practiced throughout history in many religions, the sacrifice of a maiden to save a community. Des died, and from her sacrifice an angel was born, that being Azrael. I personally think this angel was made the same way as it was in Undertale, that Des was a human whose soul persisted after death and fused with Azrael, and the flowers are being used in part to obscure the fact that Des wasn't a deer monster like her family. I don't have much new to offer when it comes to the interpretation of Des as a human or monster. It is a never-ending back and forth about how you decide to view the evidence for either side. What about the shoes fitted for hooves? Those could be your sister's shoes. She even has Azrael's retainer in that box. What about the human-looking tennis shoes in her closets? Maybe she just yoinked those while exploring the forest or something. What about the toilet in her household? The monsters in Undertale don't use toilets. While true, monsters in Deltarune might be different, since they don't seem to use magic. But Papyrus is from Deltarune and he doesn't even know what a toilet is. Papyrus seems to have lost his memories though. The flashback shows Des as antlers. It also shows that Chris has horns, so she might be wearing a headband like them. If Des was the second hero, then why doesn't the hero have antlers in the prophecy panel? Des's antlers could have fallen off. Trust me when I say I've heard almost every argument before. I think one of the ones people consider most damning is how can Des be a human if she's the sword magician, implying she can use magic. Personally, I believe that humans and monsters could use magic in the not too distant past of Deltarune, something further supported by Gersten's lore dump in Undertale's 10th anniversary stream, where he mentioned humans sacrificed their ability to use magic in the past to create the barrier. In Deltarune, I think we have evidence of humans being able to use magic as well, at least in the Dark World. In the first 3 chapters of the game, you can get 3 different colored ribbons, white, pink, and blue. Put them together and what do you get? The trans flag! Though, being more serious for a moment, each of these colors correspond to our 3 heroes, Ralze, Susie, and Chris. The blue ribbon gives a boost to magic and healing effects. These attributes seem like they'd be the kind of bad on Chris if they couldn't use magic, which I think hints that they actually could. Though maybe it's also a sign that their roles are all mixed up, like when Susie switches control between all their characters during Tenna's Island board. Though speaking of, it's interesting that hero_sword and hero_axe are the only ones that can equip the blue ribbon in the game, though you can only equip it to the latter if you're controlling them at that time. Again, the evidence can always be interpreted in multiple ways. I've even had the thought recently while watching the Undertale 6th anniversary stream that maybe Des was a monster in the light world, but became human while in the dark world when hearing Toby Fox discuss the opposite of this idea. However, I will be continuing this analysis under the assumption that Des was a human in both worlds and gave her soul, which persisted after death, to Azrael to allow him to become the angel. Azrael being an angel is something I'm actually quite certain of, unlike human Des. From the prophecy, we know that the angel has been banished, but will soon return to meet its desire. Azrael has been banished to college, and will be returning soon. Many have interpreted the desire that Noelle will meet if she reawakens as the angel to be Des, but meeting Des would be a desire shared by Azrael as well. The prophecy is modular, with the same people able to fill different roles based on what events occur, so that the events of the prophecy will transpire as predicted, even if under a different context. That's what I think Toby Fox means when he says the game will have only one ending. My Deltarune. Despite Azrael's immense power, I think he was unable to defeat Noelle in the night. In the room with the 3 purple monsters, it's notable that this is the only Dark World section room we see the cactus in. Because of this, I actually think that Carol was present for the moment that Des died, and saw the strength that Noelle possessed. Queen, who parallels Carol in some interesting ways, mentions that she wants Noelle because she is strong. And this would be the moment where Carol sees Noelle at her strongest. This could also be the reason why Carol's so harsh and distant with her. She believes it will bring out her true strength. Following this room, we see a room with 3 goldenrod monsters. Now, this is where I believe what's depicted in the sword route diverges from what occurs in reality of Deltarune. While in the game, you simply kill 3 goldenrod monsters and then proceed to kill the lone purple monster hiding in the room behind them. What I think occurred in reality is that Asgore intervened in Azrael's fight, and betrayal killed the knight, freeing Noelle from its control, who repressed these memories to cope with the trauma. When the Dark World vanished, what was left of the knight was a dead kid, a broken vessel, holding not a sword but a pencil, leaving Asgore with no justification to use lethal force. Asgore said that he just wanted to protect everyone, but nobody believed him. He had to be dismissed from the force because of this. Carol had no choice, but she continues to support him, either because she knows the truth of that day, or views him as necessary to fulfill the prophecy once again. In the room with the lone purple monster, this is Azrael at his weakest moment, the all-powerful angel becoming the crying little kid like we saw in Undertale. In Chapter 3, when fighting Ribic, there's a small chance they will mention a lost and lost and lost girl, and a crying and crying and crying boy. At the same time that Des was lost, Azrael cried. What's a further note is that in the S-rank room, we see one of the stars on the wall, the same stars that we see behind Azrael's bed, fall to the floor, implying that Azrael is the fallen star. There's a certain book in Chapter 4 that reads, "And so wept the fallen star, making rivers from its tears. Then slowly from the bitter water something grew. It looked like glass." I think that the angel's power was great enough that it was able to reach the light world. Board 1, the desert world, is the past. Board 2, the island board, is the present. One where water is a scarcity, and one where it's a 7.8 out of a 10 Pokemon game. It also again seems rather fitting, a sacrifice of a girl for rain for an arid region. This might seem to be a bit of a strange claim, that the events within the Dark World affected the Light World, but consider that Spamton wanted the discarded device in Queen's basement to obtain more power to achieve his goals. That he wanted to stop being a doll, to become a real boy. When he found it wasn't enough, he then wanted your soul, believing it to be enough to reach heaven, the Light World. It seems that if something is powerful enough, it retains what it is in both worlds. This is why the Black Shard is the Black Shard in both the Light World and the Dark World, being the most powerful weapon you can attain. Going back to the book though, it mentions the tears formed a river of bitter water, and from that, glass formed. You can actually obtain an item called a bitter tear by embezzling Miss Mizzle. It's even stated to be bitter water that fell in droplets from the sky, and its effect is to heal a party member to full HP, to revive them. It could be then that Azrael wished to bring Des back to life, but couldn't, even with his immense power. What's interesting is that Rousey has no reaction if you give the bitter tear to him, unlike most every other item in the game. Rousey often clams up when he wants to keep secrets, like he did with the prophecy, so this would further the connection between him and Azrael under my hypothesis. The Mizzles are also rather notable enemies, as they first confront you in water coolers, which through various texts are hinted at being water bottles. Carol has a full fridge full of bottled water, and to Miss Mizzle, you can mention the beauty of the cactus, again, the flower associated with Carol. What does it all mean? I'm honestly not sure right now, but it's neat. The glass that formed though? Well, that's a shadow crystal, or at least it became a shadow crystal, as they're literally called glass in the Light World inventory. In Chapter 4, if you try to drop it, the narration states that it would be like throwing away someone's question mark, and I'm going to say that it's a lightener's discarded hopes and dreams manifested through their tears. Think about the shadow crystals we have found so far. One was found in a discarded device by Spamton, which is heavily implied to be drawn by the ghost that would become Metaton in Undertale, while having to abandon the stream in Deltarune. It's all too easy to imagine them, seeing this body they cannot leave, and being brought to tears at something that can never exist in reality. The shadow crystal in Chapter 4 was found in Gerson's desk, while the hammer with his dust spread about it was found in Alvin's desk. Again, it's all too easy to imagine Alvin looking at the glass case containing his father's dust and being brought to tears that he'll never be able to speak to his father again. In Chapter 3, which I think makes the connection between the shadow crystals and the tears of Leitners undeniable, we see the roaring knight crying right before they face us, and I believe that is the moment their shadow crystal formed. In fact, I think Ram proves that it's the tears of Leitners that make the shadow crystals. Many have noticed that Ram says the words and phrases associated with some of the shadow crystal bosses, talking about chaos, and big shots. However, if you never did the sword route, you find Ram turned to stone at the bar. A Pippins will come by and say and mention no one will shed a tear for him. This is the reason I suspect Ram cannot be a shadow crystal boss. No one will shed a tear for him. He will never receive a shadow crystal. There's one small issue though, one you may be asking already. Which Leitner formed the shadow crystal in Chapter 1? I'm going to be honest, while I have a prime suspect, Chapter 1 isn't so clear-cut. During the days when Chapter 1 was all we had, the shadow crystal didn't even exist. So maybe Toby didn't include hints for which Leitner might have created it because of that. However, if I had to guess, due to the fact that Sham locked away Jevel, the one who gives us the shadow crystal, I think said crystal was given by the Leitner who decided to lock all the toys away, which I suspect to be Azrael Dreamer, abandoning his world and the dangers it presents to the rest of them. You might think it's wrong that the shadow crystals are hopes and dreams, with Toby Fox all but confirming to us that the shadow crystals contain determination in a recent teaser for Chapter 5. However, during the fight with Azrael Dreamer and Undertale, when you use the dream option, your inventory fills with items called Last Dream, and their description stating they are the end goal of determination. In that fight, Frisk uses their determination to save the souls of their friends from Azrael Dreamer. Maybe the power of the shadow crystals will allow Chris to separate Des' soul from Azrael's, if Des really is a human, like I think. Though another possibility could be that they have the power to bring a Dustner back to life when enough of them are gathered. In Undertale, we see Flowey, who was Azrael brought back to life as a flower through determination, kinda like Gerson, able to assume his original form through the 6 human souls and all the monster souls in the underground. Right now, Sham's words seem to only confirm the existence of 5 shadow crystals, but I have a reason to suspect the actual number is 7, though I'll save that for later.
Finally, after all these rooms, we exit the Dark World section and enter back into the Light World section. Cutting down endless trees, we find a chest with the ice key in it. The ice key is used in Board 2 to unlock the Ice Palace, which I interpret as us unlocking Snowgrave from Noelle's memories. For this reason, I think the ice key is actually the Thorn Ring, and that's why we find it in the forest, since we see its Light World equivalent is a thorn. The Thorn Ring existing back then would also explain how Noelle would have been controlled in the past by the Knight to use Snowgrave on Des. That is the limit of what I can glean from Board 1 under this interpretation. There are other possible interpretations that can change how these events unfold. Maybe the flowers are meant to be representative of Darkness here, and the purple monsters are meant to be representative of boss monsters. I've seen talk about a variation of the Deltarune where we see 2 down triangles and 1 up triangle, referred to as the Nabla rune. It's possible that Des and Azrael thought that meant they needed 2 Darkners and 1 Lightener to fulfill the prophecy. Under that interpretation, it would be that Azrael was exploring the forest with Sham and the purple dragon, while Des is a monster unlike what I posited and was exploring with the fake heart and her own copy of the purple dragon. Maybe the angel Azrael actually did beat the knight, and Noelle in that final room where there's only 1 purple monster. However, I feel that the story of Deltarune is going to parallel Undertale in some key ways, so I picked this interpretation for these reasons. Asgore kills a kid, just like his Undertale counterpart killed 6. This choice of cowardly violence also causes his divorce with Toriel in both games. It also gives Asgore knowledge of the Dark Fountains, something hidden from everyone else, which is similar to how Asgore knew about the resets and had to kill 6 humans before Frisk multiple times. Azrael gains strength from the sacrifice of Des, just like how his Undertale counterpart gains power from the sacrifice of Kara's life. Des even parallels how Kara speaks if you think she is the one who interrupts the introduction sequence, However, both versions of Azrael fall to human violence against them. Their goals then are the same: to reclaim the power of the angel and bring back who they've lost. Now, before I move on to Board 2, I skimmed over a few details not to get bogged down in my summary of events. So I'll address some questions you might have here. 1. Why was Noelle brought along if she wasn't part of the prophecy? Well, there could be two explanations for this. One is that she is part of the prophecy, and the mention of the second hero being the girl with hope crossed on her heart is a different girl from the prophecy panel that says, "At last was the girl." In Dragon Blazers 2, the protagonist, the hero's sister, is cursed, making her stats significantly worse, which parallels Noelle equipping the Thorn Ring and having her HP cut to a third. However, it could also be that they didn't care to follow the prophecy. By bringing Noelle, they brought a worse fate upon themselves. Rousey posits in Chapter 4, if you're doing the weird route, that an alternative to the prophecy might be even worse. Second, and more importantly, she's also just really good at video games, and they probably thought she'd be a really strong ally. Something to further note about the ribbons I mentioned earlier. On the white and pink ribbon, Noelle will comment that they feel familiar, while having nothing interesting to say about the blue ribbon. However, the twin ribbon, which is a fusion of the white and pink ribbon, will make Noelle feel nostalgic. I believe these ribbons were owned by Azrael and Des in the past, and Noelle came up with the idea of fusing items together. The description of the twin ribbon says you'll have to put your hair into pigtails, and in the Undertale 10th anniversary stream, we see Noelle, likely next to her sister behind the tree, with pigtails.
We can only obtain the twin ribbon from Malleus, suggesting a connection between him and Noelle due to this. Malleus says that he can fix anything, except for a broken heart, given that the recipe for the Twisted Sword involves the Pure Crystal and Thorn Ring, two items with connections to Des and Noelle. I don't think it's a leap to think he was speaking about Des's heart here, or rather, her soul.
2. Where's Chris? Are you sure they weren't the one attacking them? Maybe they were possessed? Okay, I lied a bit when I said I reached the limit of what I could glean from this board. There's one more room in the Dark World section, one with a blue bird, one that you can't kill at the start because it hops from tree to tree.
I believe that bird is Chris, not just because Chris is blue, not just because Birdly calls Chris a fellow blue bird, but because the blue bird is a symbol of change, of metamorphosis.
It's clear that this event in the past has drastically changed Chris as a person, and I think that the Bluebird's behavior tells us why. At the entrance of this dark world, maybe even at the entrance of the shelter, they cowered. They hid among the trees. They let their friends and family face danger alone. Chris is the person behind the tree. Okay, well, not exactly. It can't be that simple. The man behind the tree is not just one person, one thing, but many. However, I do believe one of those things is the guilt Chris hides from this event, the one that Chris draws a tree over. I know it might seem strange that Hero_Sword isn't Chris in Board 1, given that they look like Chris, and Hero_Sword is certainly a stand-in for Chris for Boards 2 and 3. However, this is why I mentioned earlier that the symbols within the game are context dependent. For Board 1, it doesn't make much sense to me for Hero_Sword to be Chris. I'm not saying it couldn't be the case, but the Undertale parallel of Asgore killing a human kid couldn't work here at all, because he most certainly didn't kill Chris, and I think it'd be cheap if Asgore was blamed for Des's death, and wasn't actually responsible for it.
Hi! Future Leaf here. I saw a video recently that made me rethink some things. I was a bit quick to dismiss the idea that Asgore might have killed Chris. After all, Asgore killed the kids in Undertale several times, so it's possible such an event happened here, where he endlessly killed Chris, Des, or someone else until they stopped doing whatever their plan was, similar to what Sans tries to do to us in the genocide route. Another possibility is that they killed the original Chris, and the Chris we are playing as is a copy. In the Chapter 4 Egg Room, it is mentioned that Chris tried to wash a gray crease that glittered stubbornly between their fingers, suggesting they might be a copy. However, since the gray crease is only on Chris's hand, maybe Asgore just cut off their original hand, and the hand that Chris currently has is a copy, which is why Chris sees through it with the Shadow Crystal. There are lots of possible ways to interpret this information, but I won't be changing what comes to follow because of this. I just wanted to make mention of it to show that even I sometimes get tunnel vision and become too dismissive of other possibilities, which is a common problem when theorizing. That said, to make a coherent theory that goes over everything, I have to narrow some things down, or this video will probably be triple its current length, but maybe I'll make a follow-up video to address some of these new ideas I've had.
3. So why did the fake heart bring them to the shelter? They wanted to become a real boy. In the game, the soul appears on screen at first, with the graphics loading in afterwards, and hero_sword appears directly over the soul. I believe that this was the ultimate goal, to obtain a vessel suited for their desires, one that could even enter the light world. That's why we see hero_sword grow in level, and then end the game by exiting it and confronting Chris. Exiting it, mind you, from the in-game shelter. I think that one of the fake hearts within Dessa's closet had been possessed by a pointed-tailed demon. Friend most likely. I was leading them to their own doom as the demon heart. Certain darkners such as Eram and Friend have been implied to be able to manipulate or even possess other beings. The mantle on King's back flies off of him in Chapter 1. Friend is implied to be the one puppeting Spamped in Neo's strings in our fight with them, given the puppet/cat element and the fact that Friend is the only other living thing we see down the basement. We see Friend spawn from Eram's body directly, implying that they have several friends within them. Finally, the knight seems to have something within their chest as well that they exposed to us at the beginning of our fight with them. So why are they looking in the shelter for a body? This is where things get truly conspiratorial. In Undertale, in the music test room, you can find a track called Meat Factory, an unused track associated with W.D. Gaster. Meat tends to be stored in a cold area. In the intro sequence, we resemble a vessel from human parts, human meat. I think from this, it might be possible to infer that the demon heart used these four to create a vessel for themselves, and from there, things went south. 4. What about the purple dragon girl? I think it's pretty clear the dragon is important. What with how Azrael refuses to return the book and Chris felt the need to close their eyes when looking into Azrael's room in Queen's mansion to try and prevent the player from learning about him searching for it. However, it's hard for me to fit her into the board as there's nothing else present within the Dark World section that suggests her presence. The only other thing we see in the Dark World section is trees, but trees are Ralse's thing. Don't worry about that now, I'll get into it on board too. So maybe Ralse can not only take on different forms with his transformation ability, but can also associate himself with different objects. And here he was, the purple dragon girl. I'm really stretching hard here to make it fit, and that's saying something given all the other claims I've made. I'll admit though, I'm somewhat open to the idea of Ralse's appearance being more malleable than we think, and even being interpreted as a trans metaphor. Let's reevaluate though. Maybe her absence here is intentional and is meant to tell us something. What if at the start of their adventures, Des assumed herself to be the first hero, since she has human parts, while Azrael was the third hero? Deciding to reenact Chapter 1 of Lord of the Hammer, they rented out how to draw dragons and stop the dragon, only to recruit her as their ally, believing her to be the second hero. This would make the composition of their team the same as the Fun Gang, a human, a dragon, and a goat. Notably, the only time we see more distinct physical portrayals of the heroes are from Ralse's retelling of the prophecy, which seemed to match these species perfectly. So it's likely that Ralse saw this team in the past. However, for whatever reason, the Purple Dragon Girl couldn't keep up with the other heroes and was replaced with Noelle, which gave us the weird route. This would further explain why Ralse wants to prove so much to us that he's useful, that he won't get in your way, so he doesn't get replaced by Noelle, because that could lead to the worst outcome. So, one last conspiracy. It's possible that the triangles on the Deltarune, thought to be indicative of 2 lighteners and 1 darkener, can instead be interpreted as showing the souls of 1 human and 2 monsters, and that this combination is what unlocks the weird route. Des and Chris's souls are the first hero, Des and Chris are the second hero, the girls with hope crossed on their heart, Azrael and Susie are the third hero, the princess from the dark, and Noelle is the other girl mentioned in the prophecy. Despite Ralse's claim as being the prince from the dark, he actually doesn't have much backing up that claim beyond his own words. Comparatively, if we look at Susie, she actually has a crown right on top of her door, more within her room, and even refers to herself as a king multiple times. Chris, despite being non-binary, is associated with the concept of princesses through the princess ribbon, which at this point seems best suited to being equipped to them since it doesn't increase magic and can't be equipped to Susie. Both Susie and Rose say that the gloves that come with the princess ribbon don't fit, and the code also shows that Noelle would ask Chris to wear the gloves. What's interesting is how you obtain this ribbon though.
Upon seeing the panel, they'll hear the ring of heaven's call. You are met with an arduous task of crossing a pit, likely falling over and over before being met with the prophecy panel. They'll see the tail of hell take crawl. Is this not a metaphor for the game? Struggling over and over to reach the end, failing over and over before finally reaching the end and discovering who the true princess is.
It's as if both of these forces, heaven and hell, might have led them, Chris and Des, to this conclusion that they are actually the second hero. Rose states the second hero should be able to equip ribbons, and while Susie can't, Chris can. Chris and Des also both wield swords, much like the prophecy panel depicts, but Susie can't. The girl who found love, in the normal interpretation of the prophecy, is Des and Chris, who have and who will sacrifice their souls to Azrael and Susie, the prince from the dark. It might even be that prophecy panel Susie Smash said that the girl will be sacrificed to the prince. That would explain why she puts so much emphasis on the fact that Rose wouldn't let it happen, because she believes he's the one who will sacrifice her according to the prophecy, when she'll be the one to make that choice about Chris in the normal route. Rose says that they'll ensure that Chris has a good adventure tomorrow, Chapter 5, and the day after that too, Chapter 6, but no reference to anything past that, as if nothing exists past that for himself, Chris, or maybe even both of them. Gerson implies the existence of a Chapter 6, but after that, it all stopped. The ones who would write the next story, the youth, never took it up. Azrael, distraught by this event, stopped creating. He locked up the toys in the unused classroom, he hid the How to Draw Dragons book, and he never released his game. In contrast, I think that Susie will take up the white pen of hope Gerson mentioned, that she will write a new story, and that will be what Chapter 7 is. Alternatively, some people have theorized that Susie will just break the prophecy. I think that is possible. Susie is willing to be rude to break the rules of the game, not letting the spikes stop her in Chapter 1, giving herself and Rose the ability to act in Chapter 2, coming up with a different way to use her healing spell mid-combat in Chapter 4. She consistently ignores the commands of the soul whenever Chris thinks of her. The second hero is supposed to be able to equip ribbons and swords, but Susie doesn't. The prophecy says the second hero will die to save the world, but Susie refuses to go along. She finds a new idea to make things work. I'm less inclined to believe this, because it would likely mean Chris doesn't give their soul to Susie, which seems like it has to at least be a possibility. It could also just mean that this will be the true ending, where the prophecy is broken, and what I described earlier is the normal ending. I think those are the most important dangling threads. So with that, I'm going to move on to board 2. For board 2, I'm going to switch the order of analysis by tackling the Dark World first, since it should be rather brief.
Most are in agreement that part is meant to represent the weird route, and outside of the blue bird and white cloak, I don't think the symbols are necessarily meant to be connected to events that could be directly experienced in Chapter 2's weird route.
However, there are some interesting bits that could be gleaned from interpretation. In one room, we see 4 yellow monsters surrounding a pool of dark water, a dark fountain if you will. From this, I think it's possible that Asgore used the black shard to create a dark fountain within the Flower King's shop in Chapter 2, and that's why the area has been inaccessible to us following Chapter 1, since he doesn't have a soul capable of closing it. This might seem strange as we can peer through the side of the shop to see into Asgore's basement, however, the room with the flowers is actually labeled as Floor 2 in the code, so if a dark fountain was opened there, it might only reach down to the first floor, leaving the basement unenveloped by this potential dark fountain. However, it is also just possible that the dark fountain is just within the locked double doors of the second floor, though I think that's going to be something else. Asgore also mentions to Sans in Chapter 2 that he talked to his plants earlier, and he may have been literal there. Sans comments that it sounds like Beauty and the Beast, which Asgore affirms. Notable since it's a movie where the beast must earn the love of another to break a curse on his life. As a side tangent, it's interesting he gives flowers in glass cases to Rudy, suggesting he is similarly cursed. To the left, we see a room with blue fish monsters. It was stated that Undyne was seen going to the shelter before, so maybe she knew more about Dark Worlds than she let on when asked about them in Chapter 2. Above, there's a room with a yellow lizard monster with the text, "Follow the white cloak." This room may be indicative of the fact that Alphys was going to tell Chris to go with Noelle to get the chalk, and they would have been the ones to go on this adventure if Susie hadn't interrupted. There's also a room with a white monster with the text, "The forbidden path began with ice magic." I think it's likely Toriel here, given the role of a parent of forbidding their children from doing dangerous things. Toriel even forbid Chris from accessing the music video channel, and the Toriel variable in the code hiding the true appearance of the white cloak as a deer monster. The very same white cloak which appears in the room right above this one. The last thing of note is the orange trees that stand in the way of Noelle, as if blocking you from taking this weird route. I know I promised to keep this section brief, but I do have to take a moment to talk about another theory. Ralsei tree theory.
I was inspired to make this theory by, of all things, a random quote tweet that popped up on my dash, basically saying, "Ralsei's a tree," without any elaboration. I know I might as well have just said Toby Fox told me in a dream, but hear me out.
On the cover art for Deltarune Piano Collections Volume 1, we see Chris, Susie, and Ralsei together in the Dark World, and a reflection beneath this showing just Chris and Susie. As Ralsei's body can't physically exist in the Light World, and we haven't seen their Light World object. However, in the background we see some trees. What if Ralsei's Light World object was hiding in plain sight? So let's look back at Deltarune under the assumption that Ralsei is the forest that surrounds Hometown. First off, Ralsei is unique among Darkners in that he can seemingly appear in other Dark Worlds without having whatever Light World object he has carried to them. In Chapter 2, after Ralsei banished Chris and Susie from his kingdom to work on their project, we see Lancer,
Rules card,
and possibly even the original Star Walker enter Chris's inventory as they leave the Dark World. However, Ralsei stays behind, waving goodbye to us. So the natural conclusion here is that Ralsei's Light World object isn't being carried with Chris, but was left behind in Castletown. What's more, Ralsei never appears immediately within Dark Fountains, but joins us after he senses them opening. In Chapter 2 and 3's Dark Worlds, he mentions feeling a dark presence, and that he hurried over. So this further supports the idea that Ralsei stayed in Castletown and only came here upon sensing the opening of a Dark Fountain. Something neat about trees is that they can actually communicate with each other through their roots, sharing nutrients to trees that need them more, and warning about dangers such as insects. These root networks extend far and wide underground. Looking at Hometown, we see the trees everywhere, surrounding all the buildings. Their roots would then run under these buildings. They would be enveloped in the darkness that erupts from the earth when the Dark Fountain is formed within any area in Hometown, and let the other trees know of this. Let Ralsei know of this. I mentioned earlier that there were trees in the cold area of Board 1 that I believe to be Ralsei. While I'm not certain if the Darkner Ralsei, or whatever he may have been at the time, was physically present there, I think it's likely he at least witnessed what Noelle was capable of, given how dodgy he can be when talking about her, and why he mentions that it'd be a bad idea for Chris to go alone with Noelle to the festival, whether you're in the weird route or not. Personally, I think he wasn't a Darkner then, and his life started from Azrael's bitter tears raining upon the Hometown and its forest, bringing life to him, as Ralsei within the Dark Worlds, but he still retains the memories of what was seen. I also think that's why one of the prophecy panels just says roots. It's not only meant to communicate to us their origins, their roots, but it's meant to communicate to us how Ralsei can travel from Dark World to Dark World. Because the other one-word prophecy panel, Gallery, just does the same for Friend and Eram, but I'll save that for Board 3. As one last tidbit though, we might have another hint at the relationship between Azrael and Ralsei. River Person. I mentioned before that I believe Azrael's tears made rivers within Hometown. River Person obviously travels upon rivers, and as a cloaked figure, resembles Ralsei's first appearance to us. While Toby tried to dismiss the connection as a simple design choice that he likes in the 6th anniversary stream, maybe he was trying to throw us off the trail. Moving on to the Light World section, in the actual island board, to the right there's 2 blue fish monsters, one of which is with a flower. To the south, there's 2 more blue fish monsters. To the left, there's 3 purple monsters, and to the north, there's 2 yellow lizard monsters. Of course, there's one thing to note that many people don't know about. If you go into the ice caverns without having done Board 1, you're confronted by a cactus and the text, "The key was forgotten," beneath it. I mentioned Board 2's light world near the start with the conclusion that the monsters here were meant to depict Alphys, Undyne, and Toriel. However, I did omit a few others back then for the purposes of streamlining things. So let's look at it again with a more critical lens. The one I find most interesting to me is the blue fish in the river to the right. I believe that is Onion. Not only does it match up geographically, it also matches with Onion's general situation. You see, around this area on Tenna's board, there's an unwanted conch that's cracked and surrounded by washed up glass. When listened to, you hear the ocean, and narration remarks that it's a pity because it was only repeating what it knew. If you refuse to listen to it, you still hear the sound of the ocean. Onion is unwanted. They constantly repeat things Chris says back to them. They also mention hearing a song of the sea that they plan to investigate. With the image of a cracked conch surrounded by glass, I can't help but feel something bad has happened to Onion, and that's why we haven't seen them since Chapter 2. The flower across the river with the sword route version seems to be related as well. Susie mentions hearing a song across the lake at the end of Chapter 4. I already spoke on the Holiday family's relation with flowers, and I believe this one is meant to be Des. This is because on Tenna's board you can see a flower cut in half, and it mentions that despite being cut in half, it still stands strong. I can't help but think of Undyne in both the neutral and genocide routes, the girl who refuses to die after being struck down, who tries to reform her own body, and fails in the former, while succeeding in the latter. What's notable is that Black Knife uses the motif from Battle Against the True Hero, suggesting that the knight too may be someone who has been reformed by a special power. So too do I think that Des was cut down in the past, and has been reformed into something different than what she once was. Something more powerful, driven to protect what is precious to her. For the other enemies, I think they might be directly related to one another. To me, the room with 2 purple monsters is Toriel in the scene at Sans shop, one where Toriel starts to find love for Sans. Similarly, when Alphys receives a box of chocolates from Undyne, she starts to find love for her. But they're not in the same location when this happens. That's why the yellow lizard monster and the blue fish monster are in separate rooms. Both Toriel and Alphys are girls finding love, and I think that's rather important for what I'm about to get into on Board 3. The room with a sole purple monster then is likely meant to be Toriel at home, forced to stay there because Chris cut the tires on her car as a part of their plan with the Roaring Knight. But before that, there's still the cactus in the room. I said before in Board 1 that the cactus is Carol, and I'll say immediately that I still think that is the case here. Carol seems invested in Noelle going to the festival with Chris based on her call to them at the end of the Weird route, whereas Rudy seems to want Susie to go with Noelle, and Ralze plus Susie want Chris to go with Susie. As I mentioned earlier, Ralze even says it would be a bad idea to go alone with Noelle whether you're in the normal or Weird route, but he shies away from this suggestion when you're on the Weird route, likely thinking it might make the player unhappy to hear that since it's their ultimate goal. Furthermore, Noelle mentions in the past that she was forced into riding the Ferris wheel with Chris. Who forced her to do that? It could have been Chris, as during that conversation, she mentions Chris's smile during her torment, which Chris reacts with shock towards. It's a bit odd, as Chris hasn't expressed with any shock to the previous descriptions of their torture of Noelle. Chris was also stated to have forgotten how to smile by Tenna, likely due to whatever went down at the shelter. I'm of 2 minds about this, and I wish we knew if this happened before or after the shelter event. If before, then it's likely that Chris was involved in some plan to traumatize Noelle to make her stronger. If it was after, then the person who forced Noelle and Chris to ride together was likely Carol, who wanted to reawaken Noelle's angel. Queen confides to Chris that she just wants to make everyone smile, asking, "If I become an evil villain to accomplish that, is that bad?" Which mirrors the trauma that Chris inflicts upon Noelle here, that may have been brought about by Carol's deal with Chris, or what I suspect was controlling Chris at the time. With the recent Deltarune ARG asking, how long did it take her to smile, this event seems even more important now. As I mentioned earlier, you can see the cactus if you didn't complete board 1 of the sword route with the text, "The key was forgotten." On Tenna's version of board 1, there's also a cryptic line about a key hidden underneath a cactus. How did Chris get into Noelle's home at the end of Chapter 3's weird route? We know it has to be after Chapter 3, as that's when the silver watch disappears from Chris's inventory if he still had it, meaning Chris visited Noelle's home after going into the shelter. Well, the answer I posit is that they have a key, hidden underneath their favorite cactus, which allows them to open the gate. A key that Carol gave to the soul possessing Chris before we took control. That's why Carol says you are welcome anytime. Because Carol has entrusted a key to the soul so they can access their home at any time. Since the soul cannot make Chris perform any complex actions without prompts like Susie telling Chris to sit on the couch, or an item like a key to open a door. However, the soul has forgotten the key underneath the cactus, just like how the cactus in the game shows the text about the key being forgotten right beneath it. It might seem strange that the soul existed in Deltarune before us, as in the intro sequence it seems like we are summoned alongside the soul. However, I think the line asking us if we're connected is about us being connected to the soul. When our creation is discarded, the voice tells us that your name is, and it's implied that they were about to say Chris. When you look at the stats screen, these stats are the soul stats. When the soul takes damage from Chris's attacks on them in the closet, we see the HP of the soul deplete. What's more, the name listed in the stat screen is Chris, followed by since chapter X, where X is whatever chapter you started Deltarune on, implying that the soul had a different name before then, before it was named Chris by that voice. There's even more evidence that Chris was possessed by the soul even prior to our entrance into the story. Notice that Chris speaks to who we assume to be Carol on speakerphone. Why do they do this? Well, Noelle mentions that Chris's voice has been sounding weird, like they're on speaker, or that it's different from their normal voice. Chris is pretending that they are still possessed by the soul by using the speakerphone option, so that Carol does not grow suspicious of them. That's why Carol's voice sounds normal at the end of Chapter 4's weird route. The phone is no longer in speaker mode for the message Carol leaves Chris. I said that I believe that Carol actually witnessed Noelle's ultimate power, so her goal seems to be to reawaken her memories so she can access them again. In the fight with Queen, she says it's only a matter of time before her will turns and she unleashes her power, blanketing the world and before being cut off. Snow is of course the first thing to come to mind to fill in the blank, and I do think that will happen, whether in the normal route, weird route, or both. But another alternative could be darkness. Carol might desire to envelop the world in darkness so Des can return from the dead, like Gerson in the light world. And she believes that Noelle's power as the angel will be able to unleash all the darkness within the earth to do just that, causing the earth to draw its final breath. Doing this will bring about the roaring, causing titans to spawn and wreak havoc upon the land. Carol knows this though, unlike Queen, as Chris doesn't show any response to Ralsei's reveal of this information because they already know the prophecy. When checking the titan in its regeneration phase, it states it seems capable of regenerating if not fatally wounded, and as I mentioned before, Snowgrave is capable of inflicting fatal damage. Carol believes her daughter is capable of preserving this heaven for them, but things won't turn out so right. It's possible that the ultimate twist to the weird route might be that the Titans are actually Lighteners, lost eternally in the endless night. I'm rather unconfident in this theory, but it's something I thought I'd mention as I rather like the idea. I'm certain that Alvin dug up the hammer from his father's grave, considering his dialogue in Chapter 2 and us finding the hammer in his desk. Extrapolating from this, it's likely that he made the Dark Fountain in the church lobby, the first sanctuary, and met his father. It's notable that the Dark Fountain in the first sanctuary is green when we first see it, and much thinner than all the other Dark Fountains we see in the church. I'm guessing their conversation didn't go well. That's why Gerson decided to write a letter to his son. When the Roaring Knight decides to summon a Titan, they throw their swords down into a pit. Alvin mentioned in Chapter 2 that Azrael would confess to the sins of him and Chris, dropping a lizard into a pit. It could be then that this was foreshadowing Alvin being in the pit, and the Dark Fountain that sprung forth formed into a Titan with a more angelic-inspired theme inspired by Alvin's role as a priest, compared to the more demonic one we see in Ralsei's description of the Roaring. Us closing the fountain within the Titan then left Alvin unconscious in the closet, the area I think would correspond to the pit. Ralsei mentions that the Titan starts regenerating, that we've only been damaging its outer shell. That phrase, of course, brings to mind a turtle, though I admit it could easily be a coincidence. However, it seems the ultimate goal of the weird route seems to be us turning Noelle into our ultimate weapon. If we commanded Noelle to freeze the Titans, only for us to turn into a Titan, we'd be punished by our own command to her, by our desire to turn her into this weapon. Similar to how we told Kara to fight everything, only for them to slash us in the end. Now that I'm done analyzing the characters here, there are some other elements present in the Light World section that I find rather interesting. The waterfall reminds me of tears running down one's face, and you can ascend this waterfall to reach the Ice Palace quicker, as if that's meant to be the source of the bitter tears. What's interesting is that the waterfall is guarded by 4 ferns, and when you exit it, we have to cut down another fern, and then one final fern before we get to the Ice Palace. I think the fern is Dessa's flower, but I'm not certain, as the fern doesn't come up at all in other parts of Deltarune, unlike the rose and cactus. That said, the ferns springing forth from this bitter water might be enough to relate them, given the book in Chapter 4 I mentioned before. Ferns are associated with protection, resilience, and endurance, traits that could certainly be attributed to Des and that flower cut in half. In fact, there's a type of fern called a resurrection fern that can lose up to 97% of its water content and still be brought back to life in the presence of water. Remember that Ralsei said darkness based on the memory of a loved one can appear in specific darknesses. Darkness and water have been related in the game of Deltarune many times, most obviously in the term Dark Fountain, but also in the Shadow Crystal's description. A sharp shadow moves like water in the hand. It could be that the ferns are the shadow crystals, while the flower across the river is her body. Likewise, the flower cut in half on Tenna's board is her mortal coil, left behind, while the glass around the conch suggests Dessa's involvement with Onion's disappearance? Possibly? It's interesting, as you only have to cut down 1 fern to access the Ice Palace, and so far you only have to obtain 1 shadow crystal to do the weird route. The only thing that makes me doubt this is that there are 7 ferns on the board, not 5. But maybe this is just Toby's way of telling us that although Sham needs 5 shadow crystals for whatever they want to make us, there are actually 7 in all. 5 of the ferns are found in the water, but 2 of them are on land. It could be that the 5 shadow crystals in water are the ones we find in the dark worlds we explore, while the 2 on land have already been found by other Lightners. Also, quick mention that the Tropic of Love in the bottom right corner might be another hint telling us that the topic of love is relevant to Toriel and Dalphus. It's interesting that all of the water on the island board seems to be flowing to this heart-shaped island as well. Finally, the locked doors of the Ice Palace. For some reason, some people online really hate this interpretation, but I do think the doors are meant to depict 4 triangles, and it's telling us that the angel's controlling one of them to face off against the other 3. A simple keyhole some people claim the 4th triangle and circle to be. Even looks like the angel doll made by Noelle that the soul wears in her house. And later on, we use up the white cloak after opening another door within the Ice Palace with the same symbols on the door. So even if it is meant to simply be a keyhole, we are using the white cloak, Noelle, to fill that hole. Think about what that represents. I also don't think it's a coincidence that key is a dialogue choice we can select when interacting with Noelle in the Light World in both Chapter 1 and 4. The second door is notable as it has a red outline with horns on it. As others have pointed out, this seems to be Chris's horned headband. I'm going to be honest, while I think this is meant to indicate the voice talking to us within the dark room is meant to be a darkner created from Chris's headband, I'm not sure if the headband is the demon that Chris summoned with Caddy, a normal darkner that's just been possessed and twisted by Friend, or what have you in terms of the lore. I do think though that whatever is inside was what was possessing Chris before we came in, as inside that room we see what looks like a save point, implying they know what they are as well. Chris was shown wearing the headband in the flashback when Des disappeared, so they probably wore it whenever they entered the dark world, and that could be how they know what those look like. However, considering the file that belongs to Chris we see upon opening the game shows 0 hours, it seems Chris never saved for whatever reason, as the time only
only updates upon saving the game. This could simply mean that Chris was only using it to restore HP, or that their original save file was destroyed somehow. One of the more interesting ideas I've heard suggested is that there's actually some hints in Deltarune's code about a Chapter 0. While it's more than likely just a buffer for readability so that Chapter 1 isn't listed as 0 in the code, the fact that the sword route displays a weird route that would be perfect for a potential Chapter 0 does make me question a few things. The voice also remarks we've reached the halfway point after completing Chapter 4, which would be fitting if there were 8 chapters. Maybe if Chris's save file is restored, like how Flowey did for us in Undertale, we'll be able to see all the events of the game from the very beginning. As if you play Undertale without saving, Flowey sends you all the way back to the beginning of the game when he restores it, and your save file is shown with a playtime of 0 hours, just like Chris. This would also allow us to reenact the weird route that we see on board 1. Back to the door though, the fact that the white cloak, Noelle, is used up, and hero_sword, Chris, is used up shortly thereafter, suggests that this entity also desires for the both of them to go to the festival together, like Carol did, furthering my hypothesis that these two were in communication to make this event occur before the entity was replaced by us at the start of the game. And that is everything I could gather from board 2, but before I move on to board 3, I want to mention the Forgotten Man's appearance in Chapter 3. The Forgotten Man tells us his schedule, and most have agreed these are meant to be hints about the places we can find him throughout the different chapters. What's notable is that his schedule covers chapters in the past and the future. He even mentions holding your breath and heading to the left, which is what you have to do in your fight with Ribic to meet him. Instead of croaking, your soul heads to the left, and that's how you get to Man Country. So again, this idea of the past, present, and future is, pardon the pun, present within his dialogue. There's another bit of dialogue from him though that I feel is very interesting when analyzed under this lens. The earth was covered in water. Dinosaurs appeared. An ice age. If you were to map this onto a Deltarune's timeline with the theories I've posited, you might come to the same conclusion I have. 7 years ago, the past, Azrael as the angel cried and flooded the world, or at least hometown, if that is what the Forgotten Man is perceiving as the world, since it's all we can see in the game. Recently, the present, Susie and Alphys, dinosaurs, moved to hometown, as dragons and lizards were often grouped together with dinosaurs historically. Finally, in 2 more days, the future, hometown will be covered in snow, brought upon by Noelle becoming the angel. The Light World section on board 3 is meant to be the festival. People have said the sword route is a tutorial for the weird route, and I do agree, but the climax of this weird route seems to be going to the festival, and specifically riding the Ferris wheel with Noelle once again. The only characters you see here are Susie and Ralsei, who you cut down. I don't think this is meant to be literal, although it is possible the festival will be empty due to you hurting so many residents in hometown, similar to Birdley, that it's all but cancelled. I think it's more likely that it's representative of us betraying Susie and Ralsei's desires of Chris going to the festival with Susie. What's more is to the left we see an area in much different colors than the rest of board 3, one that looks reminiscent of the bridge where Queen's car blew up, furthering the connection back to Chapter 2, where Noelle, while riding a Ferris wheel, expressed a desire to sprout angel wings and fly away, where she talked about Dessa's promise to bring her to the city. The banished angel will meet with its desire. However, these scenes are completely missing if you do the weird route. Instead, Noelle only expresses a desire to become stronger or the hope that everything is just a dream. It could be then that in the weird route, Noelle will unleash the dark fountains within the earth, covering the world in darkness to make it an eternal dream. While this could end up mirroring Undertale after a genocide route where we're confronted with eternal darkness, it does feel like it loses a bit of the ironic twist of the Lighteners, our Titans ending I mentioned before. Regardless, there's still the cactus in the room, one that you could choose to cut down if you so desire, but you don't have to, much like the bluebird in board 1. I think the game will give you the chance to kill Carol here, but the chance to kill or hurt her in Chapter 5 will likely be meaningless and have no effect on the weird route at all. One last thing you can do to twist the knife.
Next is the stanchions that act as a barrier to the entrance of the Dark World section. These are representative of Tenna. I don't think he's super relevant to Chapter 5, although maybe Asgore's TV will be doing something. I think this is more about how Tenna tried to hide the original game from Chris, to hide the parts of the past that hurt them, as he wants to focus on only the good type of nostalgia. And if you doubt this, Tenna himself, as well as his game avatar, literally appears as a barrier you have to cut down later on in this board. Following the stanchions, we see a manhole. This again is associated with the weird route, with us taking a manhole after freezing Bairdly in the Z-Rank room, which has a manhole you can enter to access the sword route as an alternate method. This section was pretty brief, and we only have 2 more to go before we finish. How long could it take? If you've been following the development of Deltarune for a while, you probably know that Toby planned after Chapter 2's demo release to put Chapters 3, 4, and 5 together as a single release for the full version of the game. While he hasn't been exactly forthcoming about the reason why things changed beyond Chapter 5 being farther off in development despite getting work done on it earlier than Chapter 3 and 4, I think Board 3's Dark World section tells us why. It's fucking huge! It might not seem like it at first because of the Ice Palace's map size, but that map is cheating, with 7 of the rooms being part of a repeating puzzle, and many of the rooms not actually representing things you can directly experience in Chapter 2, but events implied to happen on that day, and that are meant to give cryptic clues. I'd say only the 7 rooms you travel with the white cloak up to the bluebird actually represent the weird route. The gold area also has 7 rooms, so you might be thinking this 13 rooms isn't that much bigger, but there's a key difference. Board 3 doesn't repeat enemies between its rooms outside of 2 of them. These are all unique characters you will interact with throughout the chapter that are intended to have their own arcs throughout it. There's a lot to cover is what I'm saying. Before I can even analyze the enemies within it, I have to look at what it is. A dungeon we access through a manhole. I think this tells us something very interesting for Chapter 5. There's not going to be just one dark world, but instead multiple dark worlds within the various homes of the Lighteners of Hometown. We won't be able to close the fountains because we won't have a key to get into their homes. Instead, we'll have to find some way into the sewers beneath Hometown to enter the dark worlds from below, as the darkness that erupts whenever we create a dark fountain comes from within the earth. A world basked in purest light. Beneath it grew eternal night. It's more literal than you might first think. This sewer system is most likely how we've been seeing Friend and Eram travel to different dark worlds as well. Yes, I'm ready to talk about the gallery prophecy panel now. Like a Rorschach test, there are many things you can potentially see when looking at it. What I see though for this interpretation is a manhole with curtains above it, and framed portraits beside it. A combination that was shown in the S-Rank room, with a manhole hidden to the right behind some curtains, with a broken framed portrait in the Z-Rank room. This visual reading is further supported by a textual tone, as when you look at some of the definitions of gallery, it includes that of a narrow passageway. Narrow passageways are something we've been associated with the bosses and secret bosses, so I don't think this is just a coincidence, especially given what I said earlier about routes being the way Ralze travels to various dark worlds. Also, as a side note, because of multiple fountains being in existence, we will most likely be fighting even more Titan spawn this chapter within the sewer, as Titan spawn were what chased us in the narrow dark sections of Chapter 4's Sanctuary, which was a point when at least 2 fountains were opened simultaneously. This will give us a chance to finally rack up our purified/kill count. Now, onto the actual Dark World section. This is where things get really interesting. To start off with, I think we need to go over Gaster's list. The idea that the names of the person we speak to in the intro sequence of comments on if you enter them as the name of our vessel or your own name in the intro sequence have a certain level of significance. We have Beardly, Toriel, Undyne, Gerson, Caddy, Catty, Braddy, Jonkington, Alphys, Asgore, Rudy, Azriel, Sans, Papyrus, and QC. In addition, there's also further comments about how you're about to meet someone very interesting if you select Chris, Susie, or Noelle. The current frontrunner theory for the significance of these names is that they are a list of Lighteners who we can meet in the Dark World.
while the latter list is candidates for which the soul can possess.
When looking at the first list, it's easy to map out a lot of the names of Lighteners on this list who haven't appeared in the Dark World yet to enemies within this Dark World section. The Yellow Monster, Asgore, with 7 flowers. The Silver Fish, with yellow lizard monsters, Undine and Alphys. The Singing Purple Cat monsters, Caddy. The White Cat monsters, Caddy. The Teal Lizard monsters, Bratty. And the Green Lizard monsters, Jockington. You could even go further and say that the Black Monster is Rudy, while the Orange Monster is Azrael, leaving only Sans, Papyrus, and QC as names that don't appear in this list. However, I think Sans and QC aren't present as enemies because they're going to be shopkeepers in this chapter, given their actual jobs in the Light World. This might finally be the chapter where we actually get to see the use of Light World money to buy gear. What's more is that QC's Undertale counterpart was the Snowden shopkeeper, one of the few NPCs who gave you lore about the Font brothers. This is important as the shopkeepers in all past chapters have been in some way associated with the secret boss. Sham and Jevil were friends, and Sham tells you how to get the key parts to access Jevil. Swatch helped to create the discarded machine that became Spamton, Neo's body.
Spamton attempted to hire Sweet Captain Cakes to infiltrate Queen's mansion. The Addisons used to be Spamton's friends. Swatch helped to create the discarded machine that became Spamton, Neo's body, and Spamton is of course the secret boss. The only possible exception to this are Rules Card and Ramp.
Although for the first, you can stretch it a bit by saying both he and Jevil are from the same deck of playing cards. For the latter, Chapter 3 is a bit different from the rest of the chapters, and I think that's why Ramp isn't actually a shopkeeper, but presented like one. The vending machines are what you actually purchase things from this chapter, and from one of them you can even purchase a smile, but it will be sold out after completing the sword route. A vending machine also appears before Spamton Neo's fight in the weird route, so it's likely this vending machine is connected to Friend, who will likely have a connection to the Roaring Knight. So then, that only leaves Papyrus, who I think will be the secret boss by process of elimination. Given that nothing corresponding to Spamton was shown in Board 2's Dark World section, it would make sense that the secret boss isn't depicted on the board. To further Papyrus' secret boss evidence, he has a unique soul mode, an unused special attack, and a cape often confused for a scarf that would be a great weapon to follow the Black Shard and Justice Axe in the chapters prior.
Narratively, Papyrus also parallels Ralze by liking to make spaghetti, but never having actually eaten it, where Ralze is the same but with cakes. It might also explain why he's so trusting of Flowey, as Flowey reminds him of Ralze, who likes Flowey's theme. What's more, within Deltarune, Sans has never once referred to his brother as Papyrus, and his brother seems to be in a depressed state. It might be the case that he doesn't have a name or a font, and will only gain those in his usual attitude after interacting with our party, which mirrors my belief that Ralze will gain his own identity, self-confidence, and beat his defeatist attitude in the next chapter. It would also make a great deal of sense for Papyrus to be a Shadow Crystal user, as his reclusive nature matches how Jevil and Spamton have been sanctioned off from everyone else. It could be that his change of attitude, like them, was due to being exposed to the Shadow Crystal. While I'm not the biggest fan of the idea, another possibility might be that Papyrus is a Dustner brought back to life. Stick with me here. I mentioned before that the Black Shard remains the Black Shard in both the Light and Dark World due to it being the most powerful weapon you can obtain. It has an attack stat of 16. Compare that to Jevil, who has an attack stat of 10, and Spamton, who has an attack stat of 8, but it has increased to 13 upon getting the Shadow Crystal and his Neo body, but he still required more power to reach the Light World. If Gerson, who has an attack stat of 15, had used the Shadow Crystal, maybe he would have been able to pass that threshold to enter the Light World, which is why Alvin wanted him to use it. I have a feeling, though, that these Dustners brought to the real world can't exist in sunlight. Not only has Papyrus never seen the sun, but Sham says that it would be best to get home before dark during Chapter 2, implying that the knight might only be able to exist in the light world during the night, like some kind of night. This also gives a reason for Papyrus to possess a Shadow Crystal, as if Papyrus had died in the past. Then it would make perfect sense for Sans to cry over his death, and his bitter tears to make one. You might think I'm putting too much significance on Sans, but am I? I mentioned before that Gallery resembles Friend's face, while Roots also resembles Sans' face. Not only that, but in Undertale, we see pine trees around his home, a badge at his workshop, and the Deltarune appears in Judgment Hall during his most important moment in the neutral and genocide routes. He has all the symbols that we see on the shelter.
The only wrench in this theory is that Papyrus in Undertale has never seen a human. However, this might be solved if Sans only has Ralze see Papyrus in a solo fight, or if Sans has Chris wear the IC costume that we see he has in the Xbox version of Undertale. Anyway, now that we're done looking at the characters who aren't present in the game, let's actually look at the characters who are.
I'm going to talk about their potential roles, when they might appear, and their possible motivations.
Unfortunately, the first one, the orange monster using fire magic, is the most difficult one for me to figure out, but I've narrowed it down to 3 suspects: Azrael, Ralze, and Asgore. Given that it's the first monster that appears, I think we will likely encounter it at the school, as that's often the first area visited when Deltarune lets us off the rails to see how it has changed, which would fit Azrael and Ralze, but it's possible it could be an enemy that interrupts an event currently going on, such as a date with Toriel and Sans, which would fit Asgore. Azrael is my current frontrunner.
However, I do think Death is associated with the color orange. If you look back at the light puzzle in Queen's Mansion where you have to fit 5 pieces into a square, it's very easy to see this is a metaphor for the prophecy, forcing 5 pieces that don't seemingly fit together into some predetermined course. I've already talked about how Chris is the blue bird, and I believe that Des is the orange shoe, given that she has a closet full of them. To further add to this,
with each passing chapter in which we are allowed to visit the castle in Castletown, we are always able to explore a new area within it. The only area left to explore now is the room that has the door with the soul on it, a plaque with a crown on top of it, and 6 wings surrounding it. Given the angel imagery, I believe this is Azrael's room, and that he is the king of Castletown, and left Ralze, the prince, to watch over it. Part of the reason I think it could be Azrael is that Toriel said he would be coming next week, and since chapter 5 takes place on a Sunday, that is technically next week. Sans also says his brother should be able to play around when Chris's brother returns home, and I'm pretty confident that Papyrus will be the secret boss for chapter 5. It's also possible the entire reason he's visiting from university is for the festival. In addition, Ralze and Asgore are already represented on this board by the orange trees and the yellow monster respectively. While I don't think anything else on this board could represent Azrael, besides maybe the white monsters, but those seem more likely to be Toriel. However, as a potential counter-argument, it could be that Azrael does come home Sunday for the festival, but he doesn't enter the Dark World that day. I feel like the reason why his plan was initiated now, and not say any time in the past 7 years since Des went missing, was precisely because Azrael was no longer around to protect Chris from others who might manipulate them. Azrael coming home but not entering the Dark World would also satisfy the condition of coming back, meaning Papyrus should be able to play if Sans' words are to be believed. On the other hand, there's also the possibility that Sans is making a coy joke with his words, that Chris will never meet Papyrus because Azrael won't come back until chapter 7, which will be after Sans has already left the world of Deltarune. The other issue is that Azrael doesn't really have any strong connection to the color orange, like Ralze does, being the color of the trees that surround Hometown. This might be a bit of a reach, but Tenna describes the sword magician as a fiery magician girl. Maybe Des then was a fire magic user. On Board 1's Light World sections, we see 2 areas with the purple monster and the orange flower. This flower being orange here and Des using fire magic could be hinting to us that this is Azrael, with some remnant of Des' existence inside him. Maybe. It might seem a bit of a stretch. However, on Board 2, the flower we see across the river is also orange, and I already established that as Des' flower.
Thinking on it again though, it's notable that this orange flower enemy only appears atop soil in the Light World sections of Board 1 and 2. Upturned soil, as if the grave had been dug there. I know I said before that Asgore with the 3 orange flowers in Board 1 might have been him tending to his garden. However, there's also a possibility he was visiting the 3 graves of Gerson, Mutler, and Crystal. Graves that have flowers right before them. You might think I'm forgetting about Shira, but her death was rather recent, as we see in Susie's flashback in Chapter 3 that Shira's gravestone isn't present, so this number would align with the theory that the events of Board 1 take place in the past. It's possible that they may have even met these 3 in the Dark Worlds before. Some interesting ideas, all coming from a simple orange flow. Wait, now it's yellow. When you first enter this room to see the flower, it's orange, but it immediately turns yellow, like the flowers we see in the Dark World sections of Boards 2 and 3. which seem to only represent darkeners. This may be another sign that Dessa's body has been hijacked by a darkener. I better get back to Azrael before I get lost in that idea. For a small point in favor of it being Azrael, the only source of Lightworld money we've had has been Azrael's drawer that we can borrow money from in the start of Chapter 2 and 4, unless you count returning the chocolates to Sans. So Azrael appearing to give us money at the start might not be out of the question, with our choices in the previous chapter determining how much he's willing to share. And in turn, I'll share a small point against Azrael being the orange monster. Gerson mentions the field being burned in an inferno of jealousy. The orange monster using fire magic could be indicative of the fact that whoever the orange monster is, he is the one who will burn the field out of jealousy. The only thing I can think Azrael might be jealous of, though, is that Chris found an actual purple dragon GF. Next up is Ralze. He does know how to use fire magic, as we see in Chapter 4 in the fight with Balthazar. Furthermore, as Gerson's summary of the first chapter of Lord of the Hammer mentions stopping a dragon, Susie, it might then make sense that the penultimate chapter mentions a field being burned in an inferno of jealousy would refer to our other allies, Ralze's use of fire magic. The motivations for Ralze's jealousy is a bit hard to suss out, as he has never indicated such negative feelings, but his growing desire for self-autonomy might be what causes this issue. Maybe this is a fight for Ralze to improve his combat abilities, to become stronger, to try and stop the prophecy, to prevent himself from being replaced by Noelle like the Purple Dragon Girl was in the past. There's also the tweet about Ralze always getting tangled up in flowers. Well, Ralze might just burn his way out of those flowers.
Another possibility for Ralze's jealousy might be because of Noelle's strength. Ralze is a bit hesitant to talk about Noelle directly, and during the Dragon Blazer scene with Noelle and Rudy in Chapter 2, she mentions replacing the Fire Mage with an Ice Mage. Given that, it's possible she might take the place of Ralze in the party for some amount of Chapter 5, though I'm not so keen on that idea for reasons I'll get into later. Finally is Asgore. It's possible that he starts off this chapter showing off how to create a dark fountain using the Dark Shard as a way to show the others that he wasn't crazy, and that results in more dark fountains being created. And many have suggested he might get jealous of Sans for taking Toriel. However, in Undertale, Asgore doesn't seem particularly jealous of Sans and Toriel's relationship. I also think it would be a bit weird for him to be our first fight, as none of the other final bosses had a fight at both the start and the end, with the exception of the Punch-Out section with Queen in Chapter 2, I guess. Asgore has no relation to the color orange that I can think of, unless you count being the father of Azrael, who is the creator of Ralze. 2 degrees of separation. Anyway, following the orange monster is a room with a blue fish monster. First instinct is that it's Undyne, possibly having been mentally manipulated by the Roaring Knight's purple light beam they attempted to use on Toriel. You might be a bit confused by this claim, thinking that the knight was attempting to kidnap Toriel, but if that's all they were trying to do, then they could have just grabbed her, like they grabbed Undyne just a moment later. Tenna also mentions that Toriel would be in danger if she was awake when the knight arrived, but the knight was able to kidnap Undyne without any injury while she was awake. It could be that if Toriel was awake, the knight would have beat her unconscious, and that's where the risk to her life could come from. Or maybe trying to alter the mind of someone who's awake poses a danger to their life that isn't present if you try to do it while they're asleep. Either way, this could be the fight that sets up the idea of traversing the sewers. However, there was one other possibility with Onion that becomes a lot more compelling if Azrael's the first person we face. Onion isn't on Gaster's list, but they don't have a set name, so that could be the reason why this is the case. I mentioned before that something bad has happened to them after they investigated the sound below.
Maybe they'll be revealed to be a Dustner more akin to the Sound of Justice rather than the Hammer of Justice, or something. Hard to say right now.
Following that, we have the room with the white cat monsters, but they don't attack us yet, and that's when the dungeon opens up to more choices. I don't think any definitive statements on the order of the events, and fights can be made because of this. It's even possible that we'll have freedom to explore whatever dark worlds we choose from here on. Anyway, the room with the green lizard monster and the 2 flowers is Jockington. My current running theory is that the flowers here represent echo flowers. Miss Mizzle mentions that the bluest flowers are disciples of her speech, but it seems that Miss Mizzle is actually kind of self-absorbed and annoying, so I can't help but feel like she's just talked to echo flowers that are repeating all her words back to her. Likewise, I think Jockington, who does have some weird associations with the idea of copies, having like 9 different talk sprites that are all the same picture, and making 73 copies of a picture of a soccer ball at the library, might have some relation to this theme. Echo flowers are also associated with Flowey, who will probably be called back in this chapter, and some theorize that the passing conversation between sisters you hear in Undertale through them is Noelle and Des, who I associate earlier with flowers. This would also be fitting since they're in a room with Jockington next to the room with Caddy, and they both are friends with Noelle. The flower torn in half on tennis board is also surrounded by blue flowers, so they might have heard Des's final words. These next two rooms are thankfully much shorter, those being the room with the purple cat monster and the room with the teal lizard monsters, Caddy and Bratty. I think it's obvious to most that these two, despite claiming to hate each other a lot, are starting to develop feelings for each other. It might be that their hatred was born out of jealousy over their mutual feelings of affection for Azrael, and that this chapter will have them work out those feelings. Maybe we'll also convince Bratty that it's wrong to deceive Pizza Pants, but who can say? The other room with the purple cat monster surrounded by the white cat monsters might be indicating that if you hurt Caddy, Caddy will find you. This room also activates the previous white cat monster room. This is a really strange idea, but this might indicate that Caddy is the secret boss for the Chapter 5 Weird Route, as this room is likely the last you would visit after clearing everything else in the dungeon. The fact that there's specifically 8 of the white cat monsters suggests to me that Caddy is being related to spiders, and will be using purple soul mode, like Muffet. Cats are also known to hunt spiders, so maybe she'll summon spider demons. Caddy parallels Muffet by wanting to earn money to support her family, like how Muffet wants to support her spiders. She also parallels Papyrus by being the younger sibling in a pair, and might potentially parallel Sans by attacking us when we harm her sibling, like Sans wanted to do to us when we killed Papyrus, but held off on because of his promise to Toriel. Unlike Sans, she'd have no promise holding her back, so it could be that the first fight is simple retaliation for hurting our sibling Caddy, while the second one is to prevent us from proceeding with the weird route, like Sans tried to stop us from doing the genocide route. That would also explain the increase in the white cat monsters from 4 to 8, showing how much stronger she is here. I mentioned 2 ferns in board 2 possibly being representative of 2 shadow crystals in the light world. This could also be indicating that Caddy and Papyrus both have one as lighteners, but we might only be able to get one depending on which route we have taken. While dark, it might be the case that Caddy will only produce a shadow crystal if we kill her sister Catty. It's notable that she's the only other monster we fight in 2 different rooms in the manhole dungeon, so maybe we don't just injure like we did to Birdly if we use violence in our first fight, but inflict fatal damage to her like we have the potential to do so in our second fight with Birdly during the weird route. If we require all 7 of these shadow crystals to truly bring back Des as she once was, and the weird route is required for it, this would make meeting her akin to our only meeting with Kara in the genocide route. That said, under this interpretation of the 2 ferns on land as belonging to Caddy and Papyrus, I think the 4 ferns grouped together in front of the waterfall are the ones we can get in the Dark Worlds from the first 4 chapters, while the lone fern in the water likely came from Des, crying from being trapped in the shelter. Caddy having summoned a demon with Chris would make her a likely candidate for having received a shadow crystal, since they seem to be passed out by Friend. Maybe then the room ferns grouped together are the ones we get in the Dark Worlds from the first 4 chapters, while that lone fern in the water is the last piece of Des trapped in the shelter? You might doubt Caddy's significance to the story in this manner, but consider this. If Friend is helping us during the weird route, who would be the tail of hell taking Crawl in this story? I think it would be Caddy, as her playing is an anti-blessing from Planet Hell. One last interesting thing about the white cat enemy is that it starts over the pits of darkness in the rooms, which no other enemy does. That could indicate stronger association with the shadows or dark fountains. It's interesting that Caddy's fur is white, when you would expect it to be purple like the rest of her family, similar to how Ralse's natural fur should be black, but they've changed it to white? Maybe it's a sign that she's a good devil like Ralse. Just a thought. Next up is the room with all the white monsters that just stand there as you slaughter them. This room probably indicates that Toriel will not fight you at all if you choose to engage her. Rather, this confrontation will be about working out Chris's family trauma. Or maybe Chris convincing Toriel that they no longer need to be protected. Though in the weird route, you will probably just hurt her. Also, like on board 2, these monsters are in the room below the one with the Toriel variable, furthering the connection. Interestingly, in the Chapter 4 church church scene. Toriel is standing right next to Noelle and Rudy. The white monsters are in the rooms next to the white cloak and black monster. This is also a scene where Chris censors discussion of the shelter by just saying the words key or locked door if we select those choices, much like how the Toriel variable censors the true appearance of the white cloak and black monster. Speaking of that black monster, it's obviously supposed to be the Roaring Knight, as we see the hero_sword and the black monster, despite being separated by a barrier of darkness, working in tandem to achieve a goal. However, I think that this room tells us something really interesting. Chris is going to give the knight their soul, while the knight gives to Chris whatever we saw inside of them when they opened their chest at the beginning of their fight in Chapter 3, likely friend, but it could be the headband darkener or some combination of them both. We know the soul is loaded into the game whenever Chris plays it, so the fact that when we step on that switch and take control of the black monster is indicative of the soul switching places to control it. This is further backed up by the scenes where Chris is asked to think of Susie in Chapter 4. On the weird route only, we can instead choose to think of Noelle. However, in both routes, we can also think of the knight. I think that this indicates that Chris is only able to think of people that the soul can come to inhabit. Since Noelle isn't a candidate for possession in the normal route, she isn't listed there. So no matter which route you're on, the soul swap with the knight will happen, though Chris revenge killing the knight might be weird route exclusive. This would also explain the Chris_fountain in the code of chapters 1 and 2 for the dark fountains. Chris and the Roaring Knight have exchanged souls before, and the latter opened dark fountains while either using Chris's original soul or whatever inhabited them before our intervention. The identity of the knight is irrelevant for this point, but I personally think it's Rudy here, and Des will only be met at the end of Chapter 5 when the angel Noelle meets with her desire, going with Des to the city, seeing as she isn't in Gaster's list. Though I will admit it could also be the case that Gaster doesn't list Des because he isn't aware of her existence, and that's why she's able to interrupt the intro sequence, or that what Noelle meets isn't truly Des. Despite what I said about Rudy being the knight, I actually believe they both are Roaring Knights, based on the image during Ralze's description of the roaring showing two knights floating next to the titan in the center. It's not an uncommon idea in fiction for a false enemy to hype up the true villain you will face. Spoilers for Naruto, but when the 5 Kage, the leaders of the 5 ninja nations, meet together, they are confronted by Madara Uchiha. Madara? No man, it's Madara. I'll pronounce it how I want. I have a speech impediment, damn it. They are confronted by Madara Uchiha, a name so legendary and dangerous it makes the 5 nations that constantly warred with each other come together to fight him. However, it's later revealed that wasn't even the real Madara Uchiha, and we see the real one absolutely decimate the Shinobi Alliance. Imagine how much you struggled just to shave off 20% of the Roaring Knight's HP. Now imagine an even stronger Roaring Knight comes about, ready to kick your ass. Terrifying. I think this false Roaring Knight is Rudy due to various reasons. A knight being best friends with a king is a rather common trope. But beyond that, when Asgore looks at the black shard, he mentions his old friend, implying that he got it from Rudy. Rudy also fell down in the Undertale timeline and passed away, unlike the other monster who fell down and became amalgamates. In contrast, this version of Rudy is alive, while those monsters are dead, but he still seems to be suffering from a similar condition. When monsters are exposed to too much determination in Undertale, their bodies start to melt and reshape, which is reminiscent of the Roaring Knight transforming into and spawning various objects related to Des, such as a bat, a baseball, and the Shadow Mantle. However, they do not actually possess these objects. We know because we have the Shadow Mantle, which is likely left to Sham by Azrael before being stolen by Iram. The fact that they're imitations or copies is another reason why I think this Roaring Knight is a faker. Also, while you'd have to accept my theory that Des is a human, as I posited earlier, it wouldn't make sense for her to be the black deer the Toriel variable hides. My greatest piece of evidence for Rudy Knight, though, is a fortune from the ball machine that no one has figured out yet, about a chair that's going to kick your ass. All these fortunes have the potential to come true in Chapter 3, so it should be something that comes true as well. And the only character who could kick our ass in this chapter is the Roaring Knight. Looking at the fortune again, chairs are of course associated with friend, based on the Spamton sweepstakes where you can click on a chair until you got jump scared by friend. As for kicking your ass, Rudy has mentioned kicking Chris's ass,
Birdley's ass, Susie's ass, and even Sand's ass.
Interestingly, for the first three, he essentially asserts that he will protect Noelle from those who would harm her. Knights have an association of protecting fair maidens through violence, and Chris is also a knight seemingly invested in protecting Noelle. Therefore, I believe Chris's deal with Rudy is to deceive Carol by pretending to go along with her plans, but fulfill the prophecy in a different way, one that will protect Noelle from being traumatized by Carol's plan so she can go to the festival with Susie in peace. It might even be the case that Susie is the one to protect Noelle, as she can seemingly snap her out of her trance-like states like we see at the beginning of chapter 2, and when she tells Noelle it was just a dream at the end of the weird route in the same chapter. Noelle finds love from Susie, so the love that would be given by others is overridden. Though I feel like if that's all there was to this plan, Chris wouldn't be so terrified of the prophecy.
Rudy wants Susie to go with Noelle to the festival.
But maybe it's because Rudy is okay with Susie being sacrificed as the girl for Noelle to unlock her power. It could also be the case that Chris isn't sure his plan will work, since the prophecy didn't change when viewing it through the shadow crystal. The girl will still be sacrificed regardless of their plans. Also, when Chris has the chance to finish off the soul in the bathroom in chapter 4, they stop themselves. It's possible that they think that the weird route is the best way to counteract the prophecy without sacrificing anybody, despite their personal desire for it not to happen, their fear of it. Going back to the asses of people Rudy wishes to kick, we have Sans. You only get this dialogue if you go back to Rudy after seeing the cutscene with Toriel and Asgore in Sans' shop. Rudy says Asgore isn't much without him, and threatens to kick Sans' ass when learning. He has to ask him for free pickles, and that he'd give Asgore free pickles if he just asked him. It could be then that Rudy's not just motivated by protecting Noelle, but helping Asgore as well. But Asgore and him aren't in direct communication about this. When you investigate the Dreamer fridge at the end of chapter 4, it says that a bottle of ketchup stands defiantly inside. Sans being with Toriel stands against Chris's, and by extension, Rudy's plan. But why? While a rather dark idea, it could be that Rudy was planning to use that purple light to mentally manipulate Toriel into getting back with Asgore. As I mentioned before, the flowers in the glass cases are directly linked to Beauty and the Beast, a movie where the Beast must find love to break a curse. It could be then that Rudy is forcing Chris's family back together in a way that Asgore probably wouldn't want, so that Toriel is the girl who finds love. Sans then is in direct opposition to that, one that Rudy might try to beat down as the Roaring Knight. Again, this room is right above the room depicting Toriel, who would likely be with Sans, another potential hint for this fight to happen. It could also be why Sans is thankful to the three heroes for saving his life. One other idea I had about the multiple Toriels is that maybe the Knight's light beam was being used to make copies of her. I have no idea what purpose these copies might serve, so I abandoned this idea. But if anyone else wants to take a look at it, feel free. Next up is the room with the silver fish monster and the yellow lizard monsters. This is of course Undyne and Alphys. As for why they're here, I think this is the plan that Chris convinced Carol to do in order to avoid Noelle or Susie being sacrificed as the girl, or one that they failed to convince Carol to do. It's no secret that Chris doesn't like Alphys, and there's dialogue by Briefcase Dude asking Chris if they're there to complain about their teacher, implying it's something they do regularly at Town Hall. I would posit then that Chris's plan is to sacrifice Alphys as the girl who found love from the prophecy to make Undyne extremely powerful and prevent the world's end. I think it's the best explanation for the police sacrifice next week line that we hear from the call to Chris. I know it might sound like I have a pretty negative opinion on Chris that they'd be willing to do this, but I think they're just being pragmatic. They believe the prophecy is unavoidable, so might as well sacrifice this teacher that nobody really likes in an effort to save everyone else. Something notable about the yellow lizard enemies here is that they're sitting literally on the edge of the arena, as if they're waiting to be knocked into the pit. One of the Gaster followers in Undertale mentions that Gaster fell into his own creation and wonders if Alphys might suffer the same fate. In Undertale, Undyne first met Alphys while the latter was staring into the abyss in the trash zone, with a contemplative look, as Undyne puts it. It's likely that she was considering suicide by throwing herself into the pit. In Deltarune, Alphys doesn't seem to be suicidal, but she might still be in danger of being tossed. Remember once again that Azrael confessed to Chris dropping the lizard on purpose. Though, given the room below this one, Maybe she'll be saved by a certain flower man.
That's right, we've reached the final room with the yellow monster and 7 flowers.
This room is of course extremely Asgore coded. What's notable though is that the yellow monster is trapped and can only come to attack you directly after you kill all 7 flowers. The prophecy mentions the flower man trapped in an asylum, so it could be that Asgore is restrained while the flowers are attacking us. We stop them through our actions and Asgore is freed for the normal route. On the weird route, it might be that we defeat the flowers through violence and kill them, causing Asgore to be furious and attack us, only to be struck down.
One interesting idea I've heard discussed is that the Darkners based on the flowers might have appeared as humans while in the Dark World. Remember, we never saw what Chris's favorite cactus looked like in the TV world, as it was hidden behind a curtain the entire time. It could be that Darkners based on living objects behave a bit differently in Dark Worlds. I've stated before that I think Ralsei is the forest around hometown, so I think this would track if that's true, as he's the only Darkner with a monster-like appearance. This idea seems further corroborated by 6 of the 7 flowers matching the colors of the 6 human souls, and would provide Chris with a chance to get over their phobia of humans.
I think that Asgore's asylum is a self-imposed one. It's clear that people in hometown still do care for him, even Toriel prays for him. It's meant to mirror the Darkner King, who is free to leave his cell at any time, but chooses to remain locked up after having lost his authority, much like Asgore lost his job as the chief of police. Asgore needs to accept that things can't go back to how they once were. Also, as King was likely manipulated by Eram, it too suggests that Asgore might have been manipulated by them as well. Maybe he will even be wearing Eram as a type of superhero cape, inspired by the comic books on his TV. I mentioned before that Asgore appears as the Golden Rod monster in Board 1, The Past. In that time, he was a king, one with a golden crown, who is meant to protect the people, one who lays the laws of the land. Having lost that authority though, he became the Flower Man. The yellow monster's bright color reminds me of the bright yellow used in the insignias for Batman and Superman in the past. Superheroes who act outside the law to protect the people. Though at the end of the day, it is a fantasy that Asgore has trapped himself in. The comic books were given to Asgore by Alphys, who also says that Asgore is like a superhero, giving further credence to the idea that Asgore might just save Alphys there. This could also be a part of the revelation he got from looking at the conspiracy board in Carol's room. One more thing of note is that the 7 flowers seem to be the ones from the bouquet that was at Asgore and Toriel's wedding. Asgore preserves them in glass, as if trying to preserve his marriage. It could be that the flowers are trying to convince him of a way to get back with Toriel. Going back to Asgore's conversation with Sans, he asked, "What kind of flowers do you think would make her remember how she felt before?" It's possible that his flowers suggested the thorn ring as that flower when he spoke with them. Asgore has some relation to the thorn ring, as it's thematically presented as a wedding ring, and the frayed bow tie you can buy from Spamton, who sells the thorn ring, reminds Noelle of Asgore, fitting since they're both salesmen who seem rather down on their luck. The fact that it's purchased for 1,997 Kromer, Spamton's favorite year, might also mean it's Asgore's favorite year as well, specifically the year of his wedding to Toriel. It's also 1 year before they became nose-nuzzle champions in Undertale. Maybe Asgore is being convinced by his flowers that this flower, this thorn ring, will allow him to get back with Toriel. As I mentioned before, I believe the ice key we found in the forest of Board 1 is representative of the thorn ring, and we see Asgore emerge from the forest after church in Chapter 4 as if he was exploring it to find something. It might seem a bit strange to suggest this, as Spamton had the thorn ring. However, it's not a unique item. Spamton even mentions the possibility of selling a second one in his fight with him if you abandon the weird route after purchasing it. Personally, I don't think Asgore's aware he's being manipulated by his flowers, and that this will result in Toriel being manipulated as well. Again, he just doesn't seem like the type of guy to do that to me, and I hope I'm right about that. One last tidbit. The thorn ring would also be a perfect explanation for why Asgore's attacking his own child if he's going to just plain fight us in the normal route rather than simply freeing him. Finally, a personal wish of mine is that in our fight with Asgore, he might dodge our attacks like Gerson does, and Undyne said he was capable of doing that. Remember, Gerson was also able to remove our ability to use items in our fight with him, just like how Asgore smashed our mercy button. You know, Sans also messes with our battle menu as well and can dodge. We We know Gaster worked under Asgore in Undertale, and Gerson thematically parallels Gaster, so maybe this connection to the Gaster is what gives him this ability. After all, we likely meet him at the beginning of the game, and the soul is able to seemingly grant us new acts to use like Redbuster. As for why you're herding all these characters on the weird route, there are two possible interpretations I have. If we are traveling with Noelle, then it is to further increase her strength. This does seem plausible, as the Shadow Crystal when used in Chapter 3's Light World, which is impossible but the fact it's coded in anyway is meant to tell us something, describes Undyne being frozen in ice. However, I believe we should just be traversing Chapter 5 with a normal fun gang, no matter which route we are on. I think that, given the drawing of 3 people in Sans Shed in Undertale, those 3 people are Chris, Susie, and Ralsei, as it wouldn't be possible for a picture to be taken of Ralsei. Sans probably holds onto it because of us helping Papyrus out of his depression or saving his life, and that he will escape to the world of Undertale around the end of Chapter 5, when Noelle becomes the angel and causes a massive snowstorm, regardless of which route we're on, given his cryptic mention of only seeing it snow so bad once in the Xbox version of Undertale. So, in the more likely case that we're traversing with the normal fun gang, I think that it's so no girl who found love will exist beyond Noelle, as Toriel, Bratty, Catty, Alphys, and Undyne are all girls who have found love or might find love. That could also be why Hero_Scarf and Hero_Axe are also cut down at the start, us cutting off their potential to be the girl who found love. It's done so the soul can ensure that only Noelle will be used up as the girl who found love, so that she will become the perfect vessel for them. When Chris rides the Ferris wheel with Noelle, Des, or at least her corpse possessed by Friend, might appear, as I believe this is the desire she will meet in the normal route, that will awaken her memories of being the angel that were locked away. Banished, if you will. However, given that Noelle's powers have already been unlocked in the weird route, I think Noelle will freeze her without a second thought, much like how Kara did the same to Flowey in the genocide route. After we cut down the orange trees that represent Ralsei, then Tenna, there's nothing else left to look at in the manhole dungeon. But speaking of Ralsei, I did speak on him a bit earlier here when talking about the orange monster, but I did want to focus on what the ending to the prophecy with him might entail. One idea I kinda like for Ralsei trying to subvert the prophecy is by becoming a girl. Ralsei seems to be a shapeshifter, able to change his form in several ways, though even if not a literal, physical transformation into a girl, he can still fulfill the role of the girl. When Ralsei asks who you're going to the fair with, if not Noelle, you could say that you're not going. Ralsei wonders if you mean you're going to go to the castle town with Susie, and then hopes that's what you meant. It might be the case that if Susie goes with Noelle to the festival, but you go to Castletown with Ralsei, that you will banish the Angel's Heaven by closing the Dark Fountain in Castletown, sacrificing Ralsei as the girl. If Susie was with you, she'd prevent this from happening, but be unable to stop Noelle from fully awakening as the Angel. It's notable that this seems to be the pairing that Chris and Ralsei seem to want you to go with in Chapter 2. Susie meeting up with Noelle, while those two ride the Green Acid River together. So again, with that idea of the Fire and Ice Mage being swappable, maybe depending on your choices here, you can determine who will be possessed by the Angel to face off against the other 3 heroes, which seems to be what the Deltarune is depicting, what Gaster wants, a story of betrayal. One of Ralsei's weapons being the puppet scarf could be a hint that he could be puppeteered by some force against us if we try to save Noelle. Ralsei is also scared of touching the Black Shard, saying that it's something he shouldn't do, as if something bad might happen if he were to wield this weapon made of pure darkness. Maybe he'll no longer be a good devil if that were to happen. That's everything I can interpret about the individual elements within the manhole dungeon itself. However, there is one thing to take into account from the dungeon, as throughout it you have a confrontation with nearly all the major parental figures within Deltarune: Rudy, Asgore, and Toriel. However, Carol is missing. As I stated before, I don't believe Carol or Des will appear in the Dark World, at least not one with us in it. Given Carol's demand of Noelle to go to the kitchen in the normal route, it seems highly likely that she's going to ground Noelle. Thus, on the normal route, our end goal will be to rescue Noelle, who is trapped in her own room, just like we did in Chapter 2's Dark World, with Noelle finally confronting her own mother. But how will we get into Carol's house? Well, it could be that we get a key to it after defeating Asgore in one of Jackenstein's boards. we actually see the path of the first 5 chapters of the game with a king chess for king, a queen for queen, a knight for the roaring knight, a bishop for the titan, and a flower for Asgore. What's more, the queen is the only skippable icon I mentioned, which matches with her final fight being skipped if you're on the weird route. The sword icon then is the optional sword route you can take. However, no matter what path you take, it all ends with the key after the flower. Asgore. I think on the weird route, that key is meant to represent Noelle, just as the white cloak was used up to open the door on board 2. For the normal route though, that key could be many things. The key to Carol's house to explain how we got in there, the police code to access the shelter that Asgore might have held onto, or the idea I like the most, the key to access what's behind Asgore's flower shop, an entrance to the forest. Through the forest, we could access the back door to Carol's house, as it likely isn't locked. The narration only stated that there's no need to leave if we interact with it, and might have even been the way that Asgore got in. This forest pathway could even extend to the back of Town Hall and allow us to learn more lore about her before our confrontation to access the locked door on the left side of the school after we defeat her. I can't help but think that Carol was the one who closed the door to the closet on us in Chapter 1, escaping to the forest through the back entrance without a trace, so it's likely we might get that key for that door from her. Though this is mostly just speculation based on geographical observation, we do have better evidence that Carol actually is in the forest. In Tenna's version of Board 2, Pippins mentions,
"It's important to push your loved ones aside. Sometimes the plant of spikes hides in the forest. It's no rose, but its thorns hold love,"
which lets us know that a cactus can be found in the forest. The cactus is Carol, and she is investigating the forest. Likely for the thorn ring like Asgore, given the dialogue, can be interpreted to be speaking about it as well as the cactus. In Chapter 2, the Wet-Nosed Bandits mentioned they
"were attacked from the shadows by something merciless"
when they tried to sneak into the Holiday household. Maybe a potential hint at the Roaring Knight in the Light World, but it's notable that they were criminals, because Alpha states in that same chapter that
because of the mayor, there isn't any crime.
Notably, the Wet-Nosed Bandits were stopped while they were preparing to do that, before the crime even happened. I think then, it's likely they only made it as far as the forest before they were attacked by Carol. You might think it crazy that the mayor attacks criminals from the shadows of the forest, like a ninja. However, she owns a giant katana and knows how to use it for more than slicing Rudy's fruitcake, as she killed Briefcase Dude's briefcase with it. Her home also has bronze snowflakes described as shurikens, and Noelle mentions a holiday family ninja style in the Spampton sweepstakes, so the idea of Carol being some ninja badass doesn't sound as ridiculous as you might initially assume. Carol's motivation to make the weird route happen would also explain the differing phone calls we get at the end of Chapter 4. The weird route ending has Carol call Chris to let us know Noelle wants to go with Chris to the festival. The plan has succeeded, which contrasts the call to Chris at the end of the normal route to not forget our promise, because the soul hasn't assured Carol that Noelle will go to the festival with Chris. In fact, I think upon hearing that Susie planned to go to the festival with Noelle, Carol grounded Noelle to prevent this from happening, and when we try to traverse the forest to rescue her, Carol will be attacking us with shurikens from the shadows. The game has already set up this idea of light world combat in the overworld through the bit in Noelle's closet of Chris attacking the soul. Maybe at the end of it, we'll get a battle like the ones in Undertale, since the light world uses the same UI, but I'm not so certain on that. Regardless, I doubt our battle with Carol will be what convinces her to let Noelle go to the festival, but Noelle standing up for herself as she did to Queen.
Hi, another edition from Future Leaf here. I know I stated before that I don't think Noelle will be in the Dark World in Chapter 5. However, I had a certain epiphany that made me rethink some things. On Jeckenstein's final maze, we see a board with a rather large house. What's notable about it is that there's a clock that only has 11s on it, and reminded me of the Forgotten Man saying whether 11 hours or 11 years. Deltarune will be waiting. 11 is Deltarune, the symbol depicting the angel and the 3 heroes. I can't help but think that this board, then, might represent where we learn the truth of Noelle's role as the angel, Noelle's own home. Again, Noelle lives in the biggest house in hometown, and this maze is the biggest Jeckenstein gives us. Not only that, but there's a part where chains and shackles are present in the background at the start, which makes me consider the possibility that Carol might capture us and will have to be saved, similar to how Susie saved Chris from their jail cell in Chapter 1. But the thing that makes me think that Noelle might be visiting a dark world is that there's a section of this maze where we see a ladder descend down into water, which, as we established before, is a metaphor for darkness, a dark world, and then ascend to the other side. Given the chilly vibe of Carol's home, I think this would be a parallel to the ice palace from Dragon Blazers. In the normal route for Chapter 2, during the hospital scene, where Noelle plays Dragon Blazers with her dad, Noelle mentions she can't use Fire Shock because the mage left the party. I theorized before that Ralsei is the forest surrounding hometown, and it would make sense that he wouldn't be able to appear here if that's the case, because Carol's home is surrounded by pine trees that would block Ralsei's roots from extending beneath her home. So on the normal route, we wouldn't have a mage for this section when we save Noelle. However, in the weird route, she suggests using Ice Shock, which implies a mage is in the party. I think it might be the case that Noelle will be joining us during this section if we're on the weird route because of this. What implications that will have, I'm not so certain right now.
Sorry to stall before the shelter. I'm even worse than Chris at this, but the manhole dungeon is the thing that first motivated me to make this theory, and I've spent so much time thinking about it. I wanted to get basically everything I could interpret about it out there in this video. Again, while I don't think I'm going to be right about everything, I hope this theory might inspire you to make your own interpretations of the sword route. And now, finally, I believe we won't explore the shelter at all in Chapter 5 like the rest of Board 3, as it's already packed to the gills with content. At best, we might enter it at the end of Chapter 5 like a cliffhanger. Also, given Gaster's association with the number 6 and the shelter, it makes more sense for Chapter 6 to be the shelter chapter. Looking at Undertale, this area would likely parallel the true lab section, so I think the game will end on the weird route shortly following the defeat of Asgore, leaving us unable to experience this area, just like the genocide route in Undertale. I guess speaking on the shelter itself, this is where we see Hero_Sword exit the game and interact with Chris, thus setting up the idea that the shelter is a place where one can transcend the boundaries of their own world, to interact with and even reach heaven. For the Darkners, that was the light world, but for Gaster, that was our world. Maybe, just maybe, we'll finally be able to properly communicate with Chris and the rest of the cast once they reach here. It's notable that the trees surrounding the shelter are green, as all the trees in Hometown, besides the ones at the holiday residence, are orange. It could be a possible sign that doing the weird route will bring Gaster's return to the light world, or maybe further hinting at Carol's desire to bring about the weird route. As for what's actually inside the shelter, we don't really get to see anything besides Eram and Friend, but I think that already tells us a lot. Eram is likely a Darkner made from the icy pizza box that Death sets on fire as a kid, that Noelle said had burning eyes, the same title of the track that plays as you fight them. What's more, it was buried in the graveyard. Someone had to dig it up, and given that they're digging stuff up in a graveyard, I doubt that was their primary target. Darkners based on the memories of a loved one can only appear in specific darknesses. However, that doesn't mean that something won't be created if you try to force them to appear anyway. I think Susie's fountain demonstrated to us what Gerson's hammer, with its dust spread over it, will become if they're not the right type of darkness. A mindless creature willing to attack anyone, and I think that's what we'll be facing in the shelter. The other 3 deceased hometown citizens, Muddler, Crystal, and Shira. For Muddler, I unfortunately don't have much insight about him compared to the other 2. However, I think he'll be set up to parallel Chris, who has been associated with dogs, and Muddler is known as the leader of the pack, similar to how Chris leads the fun gang through Dark Worlds.
Andogany was also a silent enemy who communicated most of their emotions through body language and physical actions rather than spoken word. It's also notable that in Ralsei's description of Dark Worlds, that Friend appears in a form that looks like Andogany. So maybe Friend will be possessing his Darkner, similar to how we as the soul possess Chris. That could explain the cat-like faces we see on Andogany when it's ready to be spared. You might think I'm making an unsubstantiated leap in logic, but look again at another of Jackenstein's boards. In it, we see 3 different objects buried underground. We have a bone, which matches what's inscribed on Muddler's grave, a fish, for Shira, and that last one, which no one could identify, but when you rotate it 45 degrees, you can see that it's a snowdrake.
For Crystal, I think she provides some of the best evidence that we're going to be fighting these Darkners based on deceased loved ones. The enemy that Noelle was struggling with in Dragon Blazers was a Silver Drake, where she mentioned the Fire Mage left the party. As I theorized before, Chapter 6 is where I think Noelle could replace Ralze in your party. It's likely then that this Silver Drake is a Darkner based on Crystal, Snowy's mom, since they're Snow Drakes. There's no other Drake enemy in Undertale or Deltarune, and the color silver is rather uncommon in Deltarune, with only 5 mentions of it in the game, with Silver Drake accounting for 2 of them, the Silver Card, which Noelle says pairs nicely with her Silver Watch, and finally the Silver Stars that Chris sees while fighting the Knight, who is almost certainly connected to Noelle. As a bit of a supplemental evidence I find neat, there's a picture of Silver Drake with one of their parents put into Gift Trot, a silver deer who's associated with Christmas. Sound familiar? Gift Trot is also one of the only monsters you can give gifts to, and can even refuse your gift, and a monster you can add or remove decorations from, like how you equip or unequip items from Noelle. Finally, we have Shira, the brave singer. This one is rather complicated. I mentioned before that she died recently, as she wasn't in Susie's flashback in the graveyard. What's notable about Susie is that if we take her to the graveyard, this is the only grave that she comments on if we try to check it. What's more, Shiren, her sister, is one of the only NPCs in Chapter 1 that we can meet that we are unable to speak to with while having Susie with us in the light world. I believe the only other one is Dad Dragon's family, which I have some thoughts on, but nothing concrete. It is my belief that Susie is actually a monster raised in a family of humans, in contrast to Chris's family. When told about gingerbread men and gingerbread monsters by Toriel, Susie thinks the idea of gingerbread monsters is cool, as if she never encountered the idea before, but had seen gingerbread men. What's more, she knows how to clean up bloodstains using vinegar, something that Toriel, despite being in Chris's room and seeing that stain, never did, as if she had no experience with cleaning up blood. This would explain why Susie thinks everything bleeds, because she has been raised in a human-centric environment where everything does bleed.
Susie also mentions flushing bath bombs in the toilets at her old school, and calls Chris a dumbass for doing it at home. Yet there are no toilets in Deltarune's school.
And I truly think that's because monsters don't need them, just like they don't need them in Undertale. However, despite my idea of Susie being raised in a human environment with a human family, Susie does know that monsters turn to dust upon death. Why is that? Well, maybe her family, her father I think honestly, was somehow involved with Shira's death. Susie says to Lancer that wannabe tough guys piss her off, and it's easy to imagine a wannabe tough guy causing the death of someone by accident. Regardless, whether intentional or an accident, Shira turned to dust right in front of Susie's eyes, and that's how she learned this fact about monster biology, which led to her being found crying in the graveyard by Toriel. I feel like I'm going to get a lot of rebuttal to this in the comments, so let me walk you through this hypothetical comment chain before anyone gets the idea. But what about Susie's and Sans blood? Clearly monsters from Deltarune can bleed despite turning to dust upon death, like Undertale monsters. Papyrus doesn't bleed though, and he should be from Deltarune as well. Oh, Papyrus is a Darkner though, unlike Sans?
Even if Papyrus is a Darkner, which I admit is a possibility, there's no suggestion that his physiology has changed. He still turns to dust upon death, whereas Tenna doesn't, even though he can die.
Oh, Sans and Susie are both just half humans, and Papyrus is Sans' half-brother, who's a full monster. That very concept of a monster-human hybrid hasn't been hinted at in any way in either series, nor has the idea that Sans and Papyrus are only half-brothers. While I won't reject its existence, there's a much better answer to why Sans and Susie bleed that's actually supported by information we can find in the game. Okay, smart guy, what's your answer then? Susie is shown drinking exclusively red fruit punch that she says looks like blood at the church on the same day her hand bleeds, and Sans is known to drink lots of ketchup, with ketchup being what Chris used to trick Noelle into thinking they were bleeding. The game has set up this association of blood and red liquids, so that when a certain scene requires blood for a certain shock factor, the monsters can bleed, despite that contradicting the lore given about their biology. That's silly! I get why many people want to dismiss this theory by calling it silly. Sans and Susie bleeding are two of the most iconic moments in Toby Fox's games. They think it undermines these scenes if it's not actually blood. If that's your take, that's fine. Even if I'm 100% right that it was Toby Fox's intention to have Susie and Sans bleed fruit punch and ketchup, I personally don't believe the game is ever going to explicitly tell us that for that reason. The blood is necessary for Susie smashing the prophecy to make it clear to us at a glance that Susie saw something that filled her with such emotion that she was willing to hurt herself to make it go away. That is why Susie needs to bleed, but that doesn't mean it actually had to be blood. Again, I think this theory is the most logically consistent explanation with the information presented to us within Deltarune, because the game goes out of its way to say that ketchup and fruit punch look like blood. This theory also doesn't require inventing something new, not talked about within the game, like a hybrid being, to explain it, which I'm going to be brutally honest here, are the worst type of theories. Sure, I can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Susie or Sans aren't hybrid beings, but I can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ash Ketchum isn't in a coma and the entirety of the Pokemon anime is just a dream. Just because you can't disprove something doesn't mean you should take it as true. Back to Shira. Her fight with Susie would probably be to resolve Susie's guilt over this incident. Susie's also further connected to Shira by hearing the song from the sea, which would fit with Shira being an aquatic singer perfectly. If we look at the amalgamate that she's a part of, Lemon Bread, like we did with Snowdrake's mother, there's also some interesting stuff to possibly interpret from it. When we first encounter her in the overworld, she's disguised as a save point. It's implied that she knows what they look like because of this, as save points are not visible to anyone who doesn't have the power to save, so she would have had the potential to save at one point. There's further evidence backing this up, since File 8 belongs to Flowey, and it's implied that Files 1 through 6 belong to 6 human souls, as we see Flowey use 2, 3, and 6 in our fight. That would leave a gap between 6 and 8 for File 7 to belong to Lemon Bread, who was created before Flowey. It is possible that Kara had File 1 instead, though from the way the game handles the save files, I feel that Kara and Frisk have some kind of joint control over files 0 and 9, though I admit it's up to interpretation. That said, it could be the case that this will hint at Susie getting the power to see save points in the future, and possibly associating her with the number 7. Lemon Bread being sisters with Shiren likely implies that Shira had the same relationship as well. I think Susie will further parallel Shira by having a sister. I think we even know her name, Susie, with a Z this time. You might be thinking that Susie is just a different spelling, but they're the same character. However, that ignores Catty and Caddy, who are also sisters, and their homophonic names are differentiated the exact same way in katakana as Susie and Susie. Shiren's sister often spoke to her in Undertale because she had issues doing so herself. Susie tells Chris that quiet people piss her off as she threatens them, something that King also says to Chris later. Taking King as the fatherly counterpart, it's not too hard to imagine that Susie has a sister who quietly endures her father's abuse, and it pisses Susie off seeing that, yet the same behavior has also rubbed off on her. It could potentially be a mother who quietly sits by as her daughters are abused. However, I lean towards the former interpretation, as Susie mentions the protagonist's sister in Dragon Blazers 2 has been cursed, but she's still your party member. Susie's sister has lost her voice, whether by traumatic abuse or some other means, but she's still her family. It might seem like I'm reaching with this idea of Susie's sister being cursed to lose her voice, but Chris has been cursed by the human soul, stripped of their original voice that only returns when it has left their body. Looking at the 3 deceased members as a group, it's notable that those 3 are all part of the only amalgamates that we actually see in the true pacifist epilogue of Undertale return to their families. Memory Head and Reaper Bird do not show up. While it's possible that means they're fully original to Undertale, the fact that Everyman, who was part of Reaper Bird's attacks, has shown up in Deltarune makes me doubt that. Memory Head is notable for coming out of a sink, which might answer Rudy's question about why Chris is obsessed with those things. You can also call it on the phone to speak with it, so maybe you'll finally be able to use your phone in the dark world without just hearing garbage noise. The Memory Heads are unique in that they can actually put a piece of themselves into your inventory when you use the item menu, which seems to parallel how Jevil and Spamton turned themselves into items to give themselves to you. And Susie chipping the Knight's sword to get the black shard. You might be asking about Gerson, but the item that the memory head gives you is called Bad Memory, and he's supposed to be a darkener patterned off the memory of a loved one, giving further credence to the idea that these more horrific darkeners are the result of dark fountains created by people without proper memories of the loved one in question. I'm doubtful of the idea of a secret boss in Chapter 6, but us fighting deaths and confronting the bad memories that Chris and Noelle have repressed definitely seems like a possibility. For Reaper Bird, I don't have much to say unfortunately. He doesn't appear in the end credits of the game, so it might even be real. When it encounters us, it does so with a smiley face, which is the encounter sign we see on the genocide route that evokes Kara's creepy smile to me. Kara is another potential answer to the identity of the angel in the prophecy for Undertale, and we could pray to Reaper Bird. However, that just seems to be a reference to Whimsalot's act on them. However, its association with Everyman is rather interesting. Everyman attacks with copies in its head, so maybe we'll encounter goner copies of Lightners here? Speaking of monochrome copies, there's also the vessel. I'm honestly perfectly fine if it doesn't have any true narrative function in the story, as I think it already served its thematic purpose. In the most maximalist interpretation, I think us naming the vessel at the start of the game is akin to naming Kara at the start of Undertale, so it could be that the vessel was the knight in the past, that Azrael and Des dueled strife by strife. However, even if it has no true narrative purpose, I think it will be the least alluded to. After all, I think the shelter is a meat factory. Maybe Toby Fox will rip off Mother 2 again and have us travel to the past in the vessel's body to fight Gaster. That's about everything I can glean from the sword route to determine the past, present, and future of Deltarune. I was only able to make this theory thanks to the efforts of so many theorists before me, like a meta study that puts together all the pieces people have come up with for one grand conclusion. Nearly all of this from a route in the game you don't even have to do, one that gives you nothing but an item that's not even required to beat an optional boss if you just get good, and alters basically nothing within the story. Honestly, that is the weirdest thing about the sword route. Despite its name, it's more like an optional side quest than an alternate route. So let's look at what happens once we complete the sword route one final time to see if there are any potential consequences for completing it. Personally, I think the sword route might continue further into the game and be a method for us to corrupt Chris, but the evidence I have for this idea is very minimal, mostly just vibes-based stuff. It seems that Hero_Sword is able to move independently of the human soul following the sword route. As the Dust Bunny in the S-Rank room says they thought they saw Chris walk by already after you beat the game. They also mentioned something about Ramb. Maybe their body turned to stone was smashed by Hero_Sword. The game also tracks your kill count in the code. So putting this together, it might be the case that we will have to fight Hero_Sword in Chapter 6, and their strength will be dependent on whether or not we did the sword route. Unfortunately, we aren't able to check under Azrael's bed to see if the odd controller has been taken to confirm this or not. So the answer to this, like everything I postulated before it, we'll just have to wait until the actual release of Chapters 5, 6, and 7.